Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in, gets comfortable, and takes its time. Tonight we're wandering into a question that is old enough to belong to myth, archaeology, and bedtime wonder all at once. What if the first civilization knew something we don't? Not necessarily how to build a spaceship or power a city with crystals, so we can gently put away the more dramatic movie trailers for now, but something quieter, stranger, and perhaps more unsettling than that. Something about the sky, the land, the seasons, memory, mathematics, or the way human beings once understood the world before history became crowded with empires, inventions, and official explanations. Before we get into that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, or this morning, or perhaps that odd in-between hour when you should probably be asleep but your brain has other ideas. And while you're there, ask yourself this. When you picture the very first civilization, what comes to mind? A city of mud brick and torchlight? Priests watching stars from rooftops? A river quietly flooding on schedule while someone somewhere notices a pattern no one has written down yet? It's a lovely question because most of us think of the distant past as simpler, duller, and mostly occupied with the practical business of surviving, which, to be fair, it often was. But survival has a funny way of producing very sharp observers. If your crops, your calendar, your gods, and your future all depend on noticing what repeats and what doesn't, you become very good at paying attention. And if you find this kind of slow curiosity soothing, if you enjoy these little evening rambles through history, science, and the stranger corners of human thought, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this quiet patch of the internet reach more people who may also enjoy drifting off while considering enormous questions that no one can quite answer before breakfast. Though I should warn you, this one may leave a small lantern burning in the back of your mind, because once you begin asking what early civilizations might have known, it becomes surprisingly hard to stop. Now, when we say the first civilization, we're already stepping onto uncertain ground. Civilization is one of those words that sounds very tidy until you look closely. Then it starts spilling out everywhere. Does it begin with cities, with writing, with organized religion, with walls, granaries, kings, accountants, suspiciously confident astronomers? Historians and archaeologists have debated this for a long time, and they do so with the calm intensity of people who can make an argument over ancient storage jars feel almost gladiatorial. Mesopotamia is often given the title because of cities like Uruk, with its temples, administration, and early writing. Egypt is never far behind. The Indus Valley enters with its carefully planned streets and drainage systems, making many modern cities look as though they were designed during a power outage. And then there are places that don't fit neatly into the list at all, because human development was not a race with a clear winner but a long, uneven process happening in many places at once. Still, for the sake of the question, let's imagine not a single place but a threshold, a point at which scattered human communities became something denser, more coordinated, more symbolic, more permanent. Villages became cities, stories became systems, observation became record, ritual became institution. And somewhere in that transformation, the first civilization, however we define it, may have seen the world in a way that we no longer do. This is not as mystical as it sounds, although it does have a talent for wandering in that direction if left unsupervised. Every culture knows things that others forget. That is true today, and it was certainly true in the ancient world. A fisherman knows currents a bureaucrat does not. A shepherd knows weather in his bones in ways a banker usually does not, unless the banker has had a very unusual week. A society built around river floods, stars, animals, stone, and seasonality may detect patterns that a society built around screens, timetables, and supermarket lighting tends to miss. Knowledge does not simply accumulate in a straight line from ignorance to brilliance. Some of it does, of course. We do know things about germs, electricity, and orbital mechanics that ancient people did not know. This is reassuring. It would be awkward if it turned out antibiotics had been standard practice in 3000 BCE and we had simply misplaced the notes. But other forms of knowledge are easily lost, especially those that are not written down, not easily measured, or not considered useful by the people who come later. Think of how many things your own grandparents or great-grandparents may have known that now sound almost exotic. How to read weather by smell. How to repair objects rather than replace them. How to identify plants, preserve food, navigate by landmarks, sense seasonal shifts without checking an app that insists it is sunny while you're visibly standing in rain. None of that requires a lost super-civilization. It only requires time, specialization, and the gentle human habit of forgetting whatever no longer seems necessary. Now expand that idea across thousands of years, and the question becomes much more interesting. What exactly might have been forgotten? One possibility is not a secret object or machine, but a framework, a way of seeing connections that we now separate into categories. Ancient people often did not divide astronomy, agriculture, religion, architecture, politics, and timekeeping the way we do. To us, those are different departments, each with its own experts, terminology, and funding problems. To an early civilization, they may have formed one continuous fabric. Watching the sky was not a hobby for a niche enthusiast in sandals. It was governance, farming, ritual, prediction, and survival all at once. If a certain star rose just before dawn, perhaps it meant the river would soon flood. If the moon behaved a certain way, perhaps a festival should begin. If the sun aligned with a temple on a certain date, perhaps heaven and earth were considered in proper conversation. We might call that religion, astronomy, or environmental awareness, depending on which modern shelf we want to file it under. They may have called it simply living in a readable world, and that word readable matters, because modern people often live in a world they control remarkably well, but do not always read particularly deeply. We can illuminate the night, climate control the room, ship food across oceans, and ignore the seasons almost entirely until a holiday reminds us to buy themed candles. Ancient people did not have that luxury. The world spoke more loudly to them because it had to. A delayed flood was not an interesting anomaly to discuss over coffee. It could be a disaster. A missed seasonal cue could mean hunger. A strange eclipse might shake a kingdom. Attention was not optional. That kind of dependence sharpens perception. It creates observers who notice recurrence, anomaly, timing, and relationship. And when such observation continues for generations, something else emerges. Long memory. Not personal memory, but civilizational memory. The kind stored in monuments, rituals, stories, alignments, and calendars. We often think of memory as words on a page, but early societies stored knowledge in many forms, in the layout of a city, in a ceremonial route walked each year, in which building caught the first light of a solstice dawn, in a myth that sounded supernatural but may also have been practical instruction wearing a dramatic costume. That last part deserves a little respect. We moderns can be oddly arrogant about myth. We hear a story involving gods, floods, monsters, or divine kings, and assume it is merely imagination. Sometimes it is. Humans are very good at imagination and have always been, but myth can also preserve memory in compressed form. A flood story may hold the echo of a real catastrophe. A tale of cosmic order may encode the importance of celestial cycles. A god who dies and returns may reflect seasonal agriculture. Ancient people were not stupid because they told stories. They were using the most durable storage system available to them, memorable narrative. To dismiss that because it is wrapped in symbolism is a bit like throwing away a letter because you dislike the envelope. So when we ask whether the first civilization knew something we don't, we're not necessarily asking whether they had hidden technology. We might be asking whether they understood pattern, dependence, and continuity more intimately than we do. Whether they recognized themselves as participants in a larger system, rather than managers standing outside it. That may sound philosophical, but it has very practical consequences. A society that sees itself as embedded in river, seasons, soil, animal life and sky behaves differently from one that sees those things mainly as resources or scenery. There is also the matter of scale. Ancient civilizations often worked on longer clocks than we do. Not always kinder clocks, certainly not easier ones, but longer ones. Temples were built for centuries. Calendars stretched across generations. Monuments addressed descendants not yet born. Agricultural routines followed rhythms older than any kingdom. Compare that with the modern preference for quarterly results, same-day shipping, and mild irritation when a video buffers for more than 4 seconds. It is possible, just possible, that early civilization knew how to think in spans of time that feel almost inaccessible to us now. Not because they were wiser in every regard, but because their survival encouraged it. Imagine living in a place where the stars are not decorative but instructional, where the horizon matters, where the river arrives with a personality, where clay tablets, oral traditions and stone alignments all say in their own ways, "Pay attention, this happened before, it will happen again." That kind of world trains a mind differently. It may produce fewer notifications but far more orientation. Orientation is another thing we've quietly misplaced. Ask a modern person where north is, and there is a decent chance they will rotate slowly like a confused sunflower until their phone rescues them. Ask someone in an ancient city aligned to cardinal directions, where sunrise and shadow mattered daily, and you might receive a much more immediate answer. Orientation in old societies was often cosmic as well as geographic. To know where you were meant knowing how your city sat under the heavens, how your temple faced, how your year turned, how your people fit into a wider order. We still orient ourselves, of course, but increasingly through grids, interfaces and logistics rather than through landscape and sky. And perhaps that is where the deeper unease of this question begins, because it is pleasant enough to imagine that the first civilization possessed some elegant lost insight. It becomes less comfortable when you suspect the lost insight may be about us. About what human attention can become when it is not outsourced. About what communities remember when memory is sacred. About how closely one can live to the realities that keep life possible. None of this means ancient civilization was some golden age. It was not. Early cities also brought hierarchy, hard labour, disease, warfare, exploitation, and the bureaucratic thrill of probably being taxed for the first time. Civilization did not arrive carrying only wisdom and a beautifully organised calendar. It also arrived with rulers, boundaries, and all the familiar human talent for making life complicated. But complexity does not cancel intelligence. In fact, it often reveals it. The same societies that built rigid hierarchies also mapped skies, tracked floods, engineered irrigation, moved stones with unnerving competence, and created symbolic systems whose meanings we still struggle to reconstruct fully. And reconstruction is the key word because so much of the ancient world reaches us half erased. Broken tablets, ruined foundations, symbols without glossaries, alignments whose purpose we argue over. We are detectives arriving late to a crime scene where the rain has been falling for 4,000 years. Sometimes we are brilliant detectives. Sometimes we are the sort who confidently identify a ritual object as possibly decorative, because we cannot think what else to call it. Archaeology is full of humility for a reason. The past does not surrender itself easily, which means there is room, not for wild fantasy exactly, but for disciplined wonder. What have we underestimated? What patterns did early civilizations observe over such long durations that their records, once lost, left us poorer without our noticing? What forms of environmental knowledge were embedded in story, architecture and ritual, then dismissed by later ages as superstition? What did they understand about water, soil, migration, seasonality, resilience, or even social cohesion that we, in all our sophistication, repeatedly have to relearn after preventable disasters? there is a tendency to assume that because we are later, we are therefore better equipped in every direction. Later means more information, more tools, more documented history, but it does not guarantee better perception. You can possess a staggering amount of data and still miss the obvious. Entire civilizations have done it. Ours may be doing it now in several departments at once. That, perhaps, is what makes this question worth following into the dark a little farther. The first civilization may not have left behind a single grand secret waiting to be uncovered under a dune by a conveniently handsome archaeologist. It may have left behind fragments of a different attentiveness, a different way of binding observation to meaning, a different sense of time, place and consequence, something less like a hidden answer and more like a lost posture of mind. And if that is true, then the story ahead becomes less about proving a romantic theory and more about listening carefully to old evidence, to cities that rose beside rivers, to stones that face the sky for reasons no one carved into a signboard, to myths that sound exaggerated until geology walks in and says, actually, there was a flood, to calendars that seem ceremonial until agriculture reveals their teeth, to the strange possibility that our ancestors were not merely trying to survive the world, but to read it with a seriousness we have almost forgotten how to practice. So rather than asking whether they had all the answers, perhaps we begin with a gentler question. What kind of questions were they asking so early, so persistently, and with such care that entire societies were built around the attempt to answer them? Once you start there, the ruins become a little less silent, and the night sky over the first cities begins to look less like a backdrop and more like the beginning of a conversation. And that is where things become a little awkward for the neat version of history many of us carry around in our heads, because the moment you try to go back far enough to ask what the first civilization might have known, you run into a problem that is both simple and enormous. Most of human experience happened before anyone wrote anything down, or at least before anyone wrote in a form that survived, can still be read, and says more than, essentially, 3 sacks of barley received on Tuesday. Useful, certainly, but not ideal when you're trying to reconstruct the inner world of early people. Before kings listed victories and priests tracked offerings, and administrators began making humanity's long official romance with record-keeping everyone's problem, there was a vast stretch of time in which people still watched, remembered, measured, feared, learned, and passed things on without leaving us a tidy archive. That can make prehistory sound like a dark room. In reality, it is more like a crowded room lit by a flickering lamp. You can see a great deal, but not all at once, and never with complete confidence. We have bones, tools, hearths, beads, pigments, graves, cut marks, post holes, footprints, seeds, pollen, river deposits, animal remains, weather patterns, bits of wall, bits of story, and the stubborn tendency of certain places to have mattered for an absurdly long time. What we do not have for most of this long span is commentary. No one wrote, "Just so you know, we arranged these stones this way because the winter sunrise matters, and also because old Tarek insisted the spirits like symmetry." We are left to infer, compare, test, argue, revise, and occasionally stare at an excavation map with the expression of someone trying to assemble a 1,000-piece puzzle after discovering the dog has eaten the sky. And yet, this earlier world matters enormously if we are asking whether the first civilization inherited knowledge rather than inventing everything from scratch. Because civilization did not appear out of nowhere one bright morning with urban planning, priesthoods, and a municipal obsession with grain storage. It emerged from much older habits of attention. The people who built the first cities were descended from people who had already been studying landscapes, animal movement, plant cycles, weather changes, water behaviour, and the sky for thousands upon thousands of years. Writing was new, observation was not, administration was new, memory was not. Monumental architecture may have become grander, but the instinct to mark place and pattern likely ran very deep already. This is one of the easiest mistakes to make when looking backward. We imagine a dramatic divide between primitive humans and civilized ones, as though the first farmers woke up one day with entirely new brains. But biologically speaking, the people living 10,000 or even 40,000 years ago were not half-finished drafts of us. They were fully human, with minds capable of abstraction, planning, symbolism, humour, grief, technical skill, social complexity, and, one assumes, occasional terrible opinions about how best to stack firewood. Their worlds differed from ours, but not because their intelligence was dimmer. If anything, many of them needed broader practical intelligence. Survival demanded it. Long before writing, humans had already mastered the art of storing information in other forms. Oral tradition is the obvious one, though modern people often underestimate it badly. We live in a world that trusts paper, screens, databases, cloud storage, and the false sense of security that comes from assuming your password manager is immortal. In oral cultures, memory is trained, socialized, and reinforced. Knowledge is repeated in stories, songs, genealogies, rituals, seasonal gatherings, and practical instruction. It is tied to performance, place, and community. It may not look like a library, but that does not mean it is fragile nonsense. In many cases, it is astonishingly resilient. People can preserve detailed information across generations when their culture treats memory not as a hobby, but as infrastructure. And oral knowledge is not only story. It can include navigation, law, ecology, astronomy, medicine, kinship, and calendar systems. Consider what it means to remember when certain fish run, when floodwaters rise, where clean water can be found in a dry season, which stars appear before seasonal change, which plants heal and which plants politely end conversations forever. That is not vague folklore. That is survival, encoded in forms people can carry without writing. If the first civilization knew something important, there is every chance part of it had been known, long before the first stylus touched clay. There are hints of this everywhere once you start looking. Take seasonal awareness. Hunter-gatherer societies and early settled communities had to pay close attention to timing. Not clock time, of course, but the recurrence of conditions. When do animals migrate? When do certain fruits ripen? When do rains fail? When is the river dangerous? When does the cold begin to bite? These are calendars in practice before they become calendars in official form. Later civilizations may formalize them with priestly classes, observational records, and monumental architecture. But the underlying skill comes from long engagement with pattern. You do not get a sophisticated agricultural calendar unless many generations have already been noticing that the world repeats itself, though never quite mechanically. The same is true of the sky. It is tempting to imagine astronomy beginning with civilization, because that is where we get clearer evidence. Alignments, records, named constellations, tracked cycles. But people did not suddenly discover the heavens when cities rose. The night sky was already the oldest screen humanity ever watched, and unlike most modern screens, it did not ask anyone to update the software. It was consistent, seasonal, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. For communities living without artificial light, the stars were not decorative extras. They structured night travel, ritual timing, storytelling, and seasonal awareness. The moon regulated darkness, visibility, tides in some regions, and perhaps social routines. Solstices and equinoxes mattered because light and season mattered. If later civilizations turned the sky into formal systems, they were refining something older, not inventing wonder from nothing. This is why prehistoric monuments can feel so unsettling. They often suggest planning, coordination, and cosmological interest long before writing. Göbekli Tepe in present-day Turkey is one of the most famous examples, and for good reason. Dating back to around the 10th millennium BCE, it includes large carved stone pillars arranged in circles, built by communities who were not yet urban in the later Mesopotamian sense, and seem to have lived before fully established farming. That alone caused archaeologists to sit up rather sharply. The old tidy story had agriculture leading neatly to surplus, then hierarchy, then religion and monuments. Göbekli Tepe seems to suggest that shared ritual or symbolic behaviour may, in some cases, have helped pull communities together before settled agricultural life was fully in place. In other words, the desire to gather, build, orient and remember may be older and more central than the textbook sequence once implied. Then there is Stonehenge, much later and in a very different context, but still a reminder that societies without writing could create structures deeply tied to landscape and sky. Whether every alignment theory survives scrutiny is another matter. Archaeologists are understandably allergic to enthusiastic nonsense by this point, but enough evidence exists to show that many prehistoric sites were not randomly arranged. They were built with intention, and that intention often involved direction, light, death, seasonality, and recurring events. The people who made them may not have left us paragraphs explaining themselves, but they left orientation embedded in stone. And stone is not the only archive. Landscapes themselves preserve habit. Ancient pathways worn by repeated movement, pollen records showing shifts in land use, burned layers indicating deliberate clearing, middens revealing diet, isotopes showing mobility, and burial practices hinting at belief and social structure. Even the choice of where to settle can tell us something. Repeated occupation of certain places suggests enduring knowledge. This valley floods, but not disastrously. This ridge is defensible. This river bend supports life. This coast gives access to food at the right times of year. Place memory can last for astonishing lengths of time. A site may remain important across cultural changes because the practical and symbolic logic of its location continues to make sense. Once you begin to see prehistory not as emptiness, but as accumulated observation, the question of inheritance becomes harder to avoid. When the first cities formed in river valleys, what did they carry forward from the much older worlds behind them? Surely not everything. Settlement changes people. Agriculture changes diets, labour, disease exposure, social hierarchy, and the pace of life. Cities create specialists, administrators, elites, infrastructure, and the kind of organised stress that eventually leads someone to invent a tax receipt. But those new forms did not erase older knowledge overnight. They absorbed, selected, transformed, and sometimes distorted it. That is likely true in religion as well. Many later civilized pantheons and rituals probably preserve traces of much older ecological and seasonal concerns. A fertility rite may look theological to us, but it may also be agricultural timing with sacred language attached. A flood myth may become cosmological narrative while still carrying memory of real environmental danger. A sacred mountain, spring, grove, or river crossing may mark a place that was meaningful for practical reasons long before formal cult institutions formed around it. Human beings are excellent at layering meaning. We rarely discard old significance completely. We build over it, rename it, crown it with ceremony, and then forget where the foundation began. There is also the matter of social memory before writing. Writing changes power because it allows information to be stored outside living bodies. That is a revolution, but it has trade-offs. In fully oral societies, remembering is shared labour. Elders, ritual specialists, navigators, healers, and storytellers hold parts of the world in active circulation. Once writing arrives, some knowledge becomes externalized. This is useful, obviously. Civilizations become capable of bureaucracy, law codes, contracts, literature, astronomical logs, historical propaganda, and all the rest. But something also shifts. What must be remembered changes. The mind can offload. Institutions become archives. Knowledge is still social, but now it can be controlled, narrowed, specialized, and separated from everyday participation. That can be an advantage, and a dangerous one. Written records preserve things oral tradition might lose, but they can also create the illusion that unwritten knowledge matters less. Later literate elites often dismiss non-literate knowledge as inferior, even when it is more grounded in direct environmental experience. We have repeated this mistake many times. Indigenous ecological knowledge ignored until a drought, fire or fishery collapse makes everyone suddenly interested. Local agricultural wisdom sidelined by centralised policy, right up until the centralised policy fails. Navigation traditions mocked until modern systems break. It would be very like history if the first civilizations also inherited practical knowledge from pre-literate peoples, benefited from it, and then gradually recast themselves as the true beginning of seriousness. There is another reason the pre-writing world may matter to our question. Knowledge formed under direct dependence on landscape is often relational rather than abstract. That does not mean it is less intellectual, it means it is embedded. You know not nature in a general sense, but this river, this wind pattern, this animal path, this sequence of stars before cold weather, this plant that grows after burning, this smell before rain. Abstraction can come later, and with civilization it often does, but embedded knowledge has a density modern people sometimes struggle to grasp. We categorize because categories are useful. Earlier communities often knew through repeated situated contact. The difference is not between ignorance and science, it is between different modes of attention, and attention, once again, may be the missing piece. People before writing had fewer ways to record externally, so many more patterns had to be noticed, held, and renewed communally. That creates a culture of rehearsal. Return to the place, repeat the route, tell the story, watch the sky, mark the season, bury the dead in remembered ways, rebuild where your parents rebuilt, meet when the moon is right. In such a world, memory is not merely about the past, it is how continuity is maintained. Civilization inherits continuity before it formalizes chronology. This may also explain why so many early written texts begin, in one way or another, already in the middle of things. The first records we can read do not sound like the first thoughts humans ever had. They sound administrative, ceremonial, legal, mythic, already structured by traditions that must have existed earlier. You do not get the Epic of Gilgamesh out of nowhere. You do not get elaborate temple routines without long prior development of ritual. You do not start by writing down the most boring grain transaction in history unless grain accounting has already become deeply important in a social system that itself took a long time to form. Writing enters a moving stream. It does not create the river. So when history begins to write, it is already inheriting an old world of practice. The first scribes are not writing at the dawn of human awareness. They are writing very late in the story of human noticing, thousands of years late. That should probably make us more cautious whenever we talk about the beginning of knowledge. More often than not, we are really talking about the beginning of surviving paperwork. None of this allows us to claim that some single forgotten truth sat intact in the prehistoric world, waiting to be dropped into the first city like a family heirloom. The past is not that tidy. Knowledge changes as societies change. Things are lost, fused, ritualized, centralized, mythologized, and repurposed. But it does make one possibility hard to ignore. The earlier civilizations may have been standing on top of very old, very patient traditions of observation that we can only partly recover now. Their achievements may have depended not only on innovation, but on inheritance from a deep pre-literate past that trained human beings to read landscape, season, sky, animal behaviour, and recurring change with extraordinary seriousness. That, in turn, puts our question in a slightly different light. Perhaps the first civilization did not know one grand secret that vanished. Perhaps it still possessed, more completely than later societies, a continuity between old embodied knowledge and new organised institutions, a bridge between the village, the ritual site, the migration path, the floodplain, the stars, and the first city wall, before knowledge split into separate boxes, before specialists claimed their corners, before text became authority in its own right. There may have been a broader integration of life and understanding, that is now difficult for us even to picture clearly. And if that sounds a little romantic, it is worth keeping our feet on the ground. Prehistoric life could be brutal. Injury, scarcity, danger, infant mortality, conflict, exposure and uncertainty were real companions. This was not a peaceful wisdom retreat with excellent night skies, but difficulty itself can sharpen forms of competence. The people before writing were not floating in misty symbolism. They were solving problems constantly. Where is water? What returns when? Which signs matter? What must be remembered exactly? What can never be forgotten because forgetting means loss? Those are the questions that shape a serious culture, whether it leaves books or not. By the time the first civilizations start building their visible worlds of temples, records, ranked labour and planned settlement, they are no longer beginning from zero. They're arriving with baggage, and in this case, baggage is not a criticism. It is a treasury. Fragments of older sky knowledge, older seasonal memory, older ritual pattern, older place attachment, older practical understanding of how to live in recurring relation with a specific world. Civilization may amplify that inheritance, distort it, turn it into ideology, or carve it into stone, but somewhere behind the official beginning, behind the first written line and the first named king, there are long generations of unnamed people who had already been learning how to read a world that had not yet learned to read itself back to them. And once those first cities rose beside rivers and began arranging earth, labour and heaven into something recognisably new, the next thing they did was look up. Not for the first time in their existence, of course. Human beings had always looked up in the ordinary physical sense. They looked up to track birds, to watch weather gather, to judge the time left before dark, to notice smoke, to follow a cliff face, to search for danger in the branches or across a ridge. Heads tilted upward long before civilization, long before villages, long before anyone put one stone carefully beside another and meant it to remain there. But there is a difference between glancing at the sky because you live under it and studying it because you suspect it is telling you something. That second kind of looking is harder to date, harder to prove, and far more important to the story. At some point, very early on, human beings must have realized that the world above them was not random, not entirely. The sun returned. The moon changed shape in a sequence. Certain stars rose in certain seasons. The length of daylight stretched and shrank. Some nights were darker than others. Some mornings came with a star low on the horizon that had not been there before, or had not been there for a very long time. The sky moved, but it did not move chaotically. It had habits. It repeated itself, though not always in ways that were immediately obvious. And once that realization took hold, the sky could no longer be only background. This would not have happened all at once, and it would not have belonged to one person. Nobody stepped out of a cave, looked upward, and announced in one flawless moment that the heavens were a patterned system with seasonal implications, spiritual significance, navigational utility, and long-term calendar potential. Human understanding rarely arrives dressed that neatly. What likely happened was slower, more social, and much more grounded. Someone noticed that cold followed a certain position of stars. Someone else learned that a change in moonlight affected when it was safest to travel at night. A group discovered that the return of a bright star before dawn lined up with the movement of animals, or the flooding of a river, or the ripening of a plant they depended on. Over generations, these observations gathered. They were repeated, checked, argued over, turned into memory, then eventually into custom. That is one of the great underappreciated achievements of early humanity. People do not need telescopes to become astronomically alert. What they need is time, necessity, and a clear sky. For most of our species' history, all three were available in generous supply. Nights were darker than anything most modern people ever experience. Even those of us lucky enough to live away from city light tend to encounter darkness in a mediated way. We have flashlights, glowing windows, roads, screens and schedules that ask very little of the night except that it should be convenient. Early humans lived in a different visual world. The sky would have been immense and crowded. The Milky Way was not a faint suggestion. It was a presence. Planets were visible. Constellations were not quaint educational diagrams, but recurring structures that punctuated the year. The moon governed more than mood. It governed visibility, travel, danger, gathering, and probably stories told close to firelight by people who knew the darkness well enough not to waste it. There is a tendency to think of scientific observation as beginning only when it becomes formal, written, and mathematical. But that is the late stage of a much longer process. Long before numbers were scratched onto tablets, people were already doing the first and most essential part of science: noticing regularity. They were recognizing that the world behaved in ways that could be learned. That realization is huge. It sits beneath farming, navigation, ritual calendars, architecture, and eventually physics. But in its earliest form, it is very humble. It is someone realizing that dawn is not just dawn. It is different from one time of year to another, that shadows fall differently, that the moon does not change shape at random, that stars appear to wheel around a fixed point, that some bright objects among them wander. You can imagine these early discoveries not as a sequence of inventions, but as a deepening relationship. The first humans who studied the sky did not stand apart from it in the modern scientific manner, taking detached measurements from a conceptual distance. They lived inside the same conditions they were trying to understand. Their bodies felt cold when the season turned. Their food supply changed with migration and ripening. Their safety shifted with darkness and moonlight. Their routes across land and water depended on orientation. Their rituals, if they had them in recognizable form, would have grown out of this same repeated contact with a world that seemed alive with recurrence. Looking up was not leisure. It was entangled with living. And that entanglement probably made ancient sky knowledge both practical and symbolic from the very beginning. We often try to split those apart. Was a star important because it marked a season, or because it was sacred? Was the moon observed for timing, or revered as power? Was the sun a practical guide, or a god? To people in very early societies, those questions may have sounded oddly broken. If something ordered life, returned reliably, governed warmth and growth, and could not be controlled by human hands, why would it not gather both practical value and sacred significance? The separation between utility and meaning is not a universal starting point. It is something cultures develop differently. So the first humans who looked up seriously were not merely becoming proto-astronomers. They were building one of the oldest bridges between pattern and significance. The sky did things. It repeated. It announced change. It offered orientation. It inspired explanation. It demanded memory. And once people began sharing those observations, the sky became social knowledge. That matters because social knowledge behaves differently from private insight. If one person notices that a star's return seems to coincide with a seasonal shift, that is useful. If the community remembers it, anticipates it, and builds activity around it, that becomes culture. Over time, such knowledge can be embedded in stories, names, ceremonies, and movement through space. It can become part of when marriages happen, when hunts begin, when planting starts, when communities gather, when the dead are honoured, when roots are taken, when leaders claim legitimacy. The sky then is no longer simply observed. It is woven into the structure of collective life. There is some evidence, indirect but persuasive, that this process began far earlier than cities. Ethnographic parallels from oral cultures show that people can preserve detailed sky knowledge without writing. Indigenous traditions in many parts of the world have included sophisticated understanding of seasonal stars, lunar cycles, navigation, and environmental timing. One must be careful not to flatten all oral cultures into a single timeless category, because that would be lazy and unfair. but the general point stands. Writing is not required for astronomy. Attention is. Repetition is. Shared memory is. A community that depends on seasonal awareness and has clear views of the sky can accumulate impressive knowledge across generations. And because this is humanity, the sky would also have become crowded with personality. Not in the childish sense sometimes implied when modern people speak about ancient belief, but in the deeply human sense that repeated forces invite narrative. If a cluster of stars returns when the weather changes, it gains character. If a planet wanders differently from the background stars, people notice. If an eclipse interrupts daylight, that is not the sort of thing you shrug off and continue alphabetizing your shelf. It demands response. A memorable event becomes a story. A story aids transmission. Transmission preserves knowledge, though not always in the form later scholars would prefer. This is where the old argument between science and myth becomes less useful. In early human life, those were not opposing teams. Myth could carry observation, and observation could shape myth. A people might tell a story about a celestial hunter, a bird, a great fish, a mother, a trickster, or a canoe in the stars, and that story might simultaneously encode orientation, seasonality, and social memory. The meaning was not reduced by narrative, it was stabilized by it. We tend to imagine that truth becomes more serious as it becomes less storied. That is a modern preference, not an eternal law. For much of human history, story was one of the most reliable ways to keep practical knowledge alive. There is also the matter of childhood. The first serious sky watchers were not all elders or specialists. Knowledge of recurrence would have been learned early. Children would hear names, gestures, timings. They would be shown where the sun rises at different times of year. They would learn which stars matter. They would absorb the sequence of seasons through the sky before they could formalize any of it. In that sense, entire populations could become calibrated to celestial pattern as part of ordinary life. Compare that with modern populations who may struggle to identify even the moon's phase without looking outside and then occasionally, rather bravely, getting it wrong. This long training of attention may explain why later civilizations seem able to formalize sky knowledge so effectively. By the time we reach the first cities, humanity is not encountering the heavens as a new intellectual field. It is deepening a very old one. The question is not when people first saw the stars, but when they began to trust that the stars, the sun and the moon could be relied upon as structures for human planning. Once that trust exists, the consequences are enormous. You can build calendars, you can coordinate labour, you can align architecture, you can legitimize rulers through cosmic order. You can treat the city not just as a place on land, but as a place in heaven's pattern. Before all that, though, there must have been a long prelude of direct noticing. Consider the simplest recurring thing of all, sunrise. It doesn't happen in exactly the same place every day. Over the course of the year, the point on the horizon shifts. Near the solstices, it slows and seems almost to pause before moving back the other way. A person who watches this repeatedly from the same place, year after year, can learn an astonishing amount. The same is true of sunset. You do not need advanced instruments to recognize that the sun has limits in its annual wandering, and that these limits matter. Mark those limits with stones, posts, notches, or memory, and suddenly the year becomes more legible. The moon teaches differently. Its phases are more obvious in the short term, easier to notice across nights. That makes it excellent for counting and expectation. It also offers a natural tension between short cycles and longer ones. Lunar months do not fit the solar year neatly, which means anyone relying on both would eventually confront a wonderfully irritating problem. The sky is orderly, but not simple. That realization alone could drive more careful observation. It may also help explain why ancient calendars become complicated, adjusted, and occasionally the sort of thing only a dedicated priest or official can keep straight without frowning. Then there are the stars themselves. Some rise and set seasonally. Some never seem to disappear. Some move strangely because they are planets, though nobody would call them that at first. Learn the difference between fixed background and wandering lights, and you're already doing high-level conceptual work. Recognize that certain star appearances predict seasonal transition, and the sky becomes calendar as well as spectacle. The first people to grasp this may not have used abstract terminology, but they did not need to. Reliable prediction is understanding whatever vocabulary it arrives in. Navigation likely played a role too, especially for people moving across open terrain, desert or water. The sky is the oldest map available everywhere at once. On land, it helps orient direction and route. On water, especially in coastal and open sea traditions that developed much later in specialized forms, it can become astonishingly precise. Even before full navigational systems emerged, regular attention to the stars would have supported movement and return. If you want to see how quickly celestial knowledge becomes practical, imagine being far from familiar landmarks, with only night overhead and a long journey ahead. The sky stops being philosophical very quickly. This shared upward attention probably changed human psychology in subtle ways as well. When a community lives by recurring celestial markers, time itself begins to feel patterned beyond immediate need. There is tonight, and tomorrow, and the next hunt, of course. But there is also the return, the reappearance, the turning, the season not merely as weather but as position in a cycle that can be anticipated. That is different from simply enduring change. It is learning that change has shape. Civilizations later formalized this into calendars, rituals and administrations, but the seed may have been planted much earlier when people realized that the sky remembered things. That phrase sounds metaphorical, but in practice it is almost literal. The heavens preserved recurrence more faithfully than any human institution. Leaders died, camps moved, rivers shifted course, storms disrupted life, but the sky returned to its patterns. Not perfectly, not transparently, and not without rare shocks, yet enough to become one of the most stable structures available to human thought. It is hard to overstate how significant that would be. In a world full of danger and uncertainty, the possibility that some things repeat reliably is more than comforting. It is foundational. It allows planning. It allows expectation. It allows the idea that order exists beyond immediate chaos. And perhaps this is why so many later civilizations place cosmic order at the center of social order. If the sky is stable, repeated, and meaningful, then aligning human life with it becomes a powerful idea. Kings rule by heaven's favor, temples mirror celestial events, festivals track cycles, the city takes its place in a larger pattern, but those later developments only make sense if long before official religion and state astronomy, people had already discovered that looking up paid off, that the heavens were not just beautiful or terrifying, but informative. There is another detail worth considering. The first humans who became serious observers of the sky were still entirely dependent on the earth beneath them. That may sound obvious, but it matters. Their celestial awareness was always tied back to soil, water, animal movement, plant timing, and survival. The sky was readable because the ground responded. A star rose, and something happened here. The moon changed, and darkness shifted here. The sun's path altered, and cold or heat followed here. Heaven and earth were linked by consequence, not by abstract theory. That kind of thinking is relational all the way through. It does not ask, what is the sky in itself at first? It asks, what does the sky mean for where we are, what we do next, and what returns when? This is one reason early celestial knowledge may have been more integrated than ours. Modern people can know plenty about astronomy while feeling almost no connection between the stars and daily life, apart from the occasional meteor shower and the mild disappointment of cloud cover. Ancient people often knew less about the physical mechanisms, obviously, but more about lived connection. Their sky was not only an object of curiosity, it was part of the practical fabric of existence. In losing that intimacy, we gained extraordinary explanatory power. Still, one sometimes wonders whether something in our sense of placement was traded away in the bargain. All of this makes the phrase, "the day the first humans looked up," a little misleading, though perhaps productively so. There was no single day. There was a long transition from seeing to reading, from noticing to trusting, from awe to patterned use. Yet it still feels right to speak of a threshold, because sooner or later there must have come a moment in many different communities when the sky stopped being simply what was above and became a structure to live by. Once that happened, memory deepened. People began teaching the heavens to one another. They named, tracked, repeated, and maybe marked. The horizon mattered differently. Dawn mattered differently. Night itself changed from darkness with lights in it to a rotating archive of clues. And once people begin marking, even in the simplest way, something else follows. A stick in the ground to track shadow. A notch aligned with sunrise. A chosen point on a ridge where the sun appears at a particular time of year. A place returned to because the horizon works from there. Then another marker. Then another. Observation wants anchors. Human beings, when they notice something repeating, are very fond of giving it a place to stand, which is how the sky, patiently teaching recurrence to generations of people who needed every useful pattern they could find, eventually begins to leave traces on the ground. And once the sky begins to leave traces on the ground, human life changes again, because noticing a pattern is one thing, but fixing it in place is something else entirely. The moment a community marks a point where the sun rises at a certain time of year, or sets between two hills, or casts a shadow of a certain length, observation stops being only memory and starts becoming structure. The world above and the world below are tied together with intention. A person no longer has to rely only on recollection or the advice of someone older. Now there is a place to stand, a stone to point at, a line to follow, a marker that says, in effect, this mattered enough for us to leave it here. That is an extraordinary shift, and it may be one of the quiet turning points in the early human thought. We tend to give great dramatic credit to inventions with obvious machinery or written instructions, but some of the most important changes in human history are nearly silent. A line of stones set with care, a post driven into the ground where a shadow can be watched, a mound with a passage facing the sunrise on a particular morning. None of these need to look flashy to be transformative. They represent the moment when recurrence becomes externalized. Knowledge moves out of the mind alone and into the environment. Once that happens, a place can remember alongside the people who use it. It is worth pausing on that because it gets to the heart of what early civilizations may have inherited. Before mathematics was written, before astronomy was formalized, before rulers could claim to hold heaven and earth in legal partnership, human beings were already turning repeated observations into durable arrangements. They were, in the broadest and oldest sense, calculating. Not always with numbers written down, not in the symbolic forms we would recognize from later tablets and papyri, but through comparison, spacing, direction, repetition, and correction. Calculation does not begin when a formula is inscribed. It begins when someone asks whether this point lines up with that one, whether the sunrise has shifted, whether the shadow falls where it did last season, whether the marker should be moved, whether the pattern returns. There is something almost touching about how modest the first steps of measurement must have been. No grand declarations, just careful attention turned into physical action. Put a stick here. Watch the shadow. Move the mark. Return tomorrow. Return after many tomorrows. Notice the extremes. Mark the limits. Teach someone younger what to look for. Compare this year to the last. There is the beginning of practical geometry in that. There is the beginning of calendar work. There is also the beginning of a certain kind of humility, because the world is not always easy to measure cleanly. The horizon is uneven. Clouds interfere. The seasons drift in ways that feel orderly but not mechanically simple. The moon refuses to line up politely with the sun. The stars are reliable, but but only if you're patient enough to meet them on their terms. Patience, in fact, may be one of the hidden foundations of all early sky knowledge set in stone. To build anything that tracks long cycles, you have to care about events beyond the immediate moment. A hunter can live by short-term alertness. A community building aligned markers must also live by return. It must value the next season and the next one after that. It must treat recurrence as important enough to anchor. That already tells us something about mentality. These were not people only reacting to what was in front of them. They were people increasingly organising attention across time, and stones were very good companions in that effort. Wood rots. Memory, though often astonishingly strong, depends on living bodies. Stone waits, it keeps its place. It does not have opinions. It does not get distracted halfway through winter, and decide the alignment can probably be estimated from vibes alone. If you want a marker to remain after rain, wind, fire, and the death of the person who placed it, stone is an excellent choice. This does not mean every stone arrangement is astronomical, of course. Archaeologists have had to spend an exhausting amount of energy resisting the idea that every ancient rock someone cannot explain must therefore be a cosmic supercomputer. Sometimes a stone is there because it was useful, available, symbolic for some other reason, or because human beings have always enjoyed moving large objects to places that later generations find confusing. But enough prehistoric and early historic structures show clear orientation and repetition that the larger point remains. Stone became one of the earliest ways to hold a conversation with the sky over long periods. What makes this especially interesting is that many of these silent calculations were probably never separated into categories the way we would separate them. To us, setting up an alignment might belong to astronomy, surveying, ritual, architecture, or seasonal planning depending on context. To the people doing it, those things may have been inseparable. The same marker might indicate a seasonal turning point, serve ceremonial gathering, reinforce social memory, and connect a community to an idea of order larger than itself. Modern thinking often insists on clean labels. Early human practice rarely owed us that convenience. Consider what is required to create even a simple alignment. You need repeated observation from a stable vantage point. You need agreement, or at least social acceptance, that the observed event matters. You need the ability to mark space consistently. You need labour, however minimal, to set the marker. If the arrangement is more elaborate, you also need planning, coordination, and the confidence that enough people will care to maintain or preserve it. That already suggests an impressive level of social organisation, even without writing. It is not empire, it is not bureaucracy in the full sense. But it is shared intention made material, and once shared intention enters material form, another layer appears. The marker begins to shape behaviour in return. People gather there, they watch from there, they teach there. Children grow up learning that this place means something. A line between two stones is not just a line. It becomes a lesson, a ritual cue, a memory device, perhaps even a claim that the community is oriented correctly in the world. In that way, calculation becomes culture. Not calculation as dry arithmetic, but as repeated comparison embedded in communal life. There is a temptation, especially in popular storytelling, to turn all this into a sort of lost genius narrative. Ancient builders are imagined as possessing secret mathematical codes, hidden frequencies, supernatural precision, or knowledge so advanced it must have come from vanished sages, vanished continents, or uninvited visitors from elsewhere in the galaxy, who apparently crossed the stars only to help arrange stones and then leave without explaining themselves. It is all very dramatic and almost always much less interesting than the truth. The truth is that human beings are capable of remarkable precision when motivated by repeated observation, collective effort, and long familiarity with place. They do not need magic to notice where the sun rises. They do not need extraterrestrial consultants to follow a shadow. They need seriousness. Seriousness is perhaps the least glamorous explanation for ancient accomplishment, which is a shame because it accounts for quite a lot. A community that watches the same horizon for generations can become very exact. A builder who works within a tradition of orientation and measurement can learn techniques that look mysterious only because the written instruction manuals are gone. A people who tie ceremony, agriculture, and authority to celestial events have every incentive to get the details right. It is not supernatural. It is disciplined attention repeated until it becomes expertise. That expertise may not always have looked like mathematics to us, but it often contained mathematical thinking. Counting intervals, estimating angles, dividing spaces, repeating proportions, observing symmetry, recognizing recurrence, and adjusting for error are all part of the same broad family. There is no need to imagine early measurement as vague approximation. Humans can be surprisingly rigorous without symbolic notation, especially when the objects of interest return predictably. In fact, one might argue that the world itself was the first textbook. The sky offered the problem set again and again. The horizon provided the diagram. The seasons marked whether your answer was useful. There is something wonderful about that image, though perhaps also a little intimidating. Imagine learning by direct correction from the sun. If your marker is wrong, the year will eventually tell you. If your alignment matters for ceremony or farming, mistakes are not philosophical, they are felt. In that sense, early calculations were grounded by consequence. This may be why they deserve more respect than they often receive. They were not abstract games. They sat at the intersection of orientation, expectation, and communal confidence. Take standing stones and circles. Even when their full function remains debated, they often suggest repeated concern with direction, spacing, and event. A solitary stone on a ridge may frame a horizon point. A circle may create a controlled interior from which lines of sight matter. A passage tomb may guide light into a dark chamber at a particular moment, linking death, memory, and the returning sun in a single architectural gesture. Whether or not every such site served a strict observational role, many clearly participated in a world where the movement of celestial bodies and the arrangement of human structures were in conversation. Passage tombs are especially striking because they show how precise orientation can become deeply symbolic without losing practical meaning. A dark chamber receiving sunlight on a specific morning is not just decorative, it is a timed event. It transforms architecture into calendar. It says the builders understood not only where to place stone, but when light would behave in a certain way. That is already a form of silent calculation. The stone waits all year for a moment that proves the people who placed it knew something about recurrence. The event itself then renews the memory of that knowledge. Year after year, perhaps century after century, the structure says the same thing without speaking. There is another side to this, and it is less romantic but equally important. Early monumental calculation also demonstrates surplus effort. To set stones, shape earthworks, or maintain alignments requires time and labour not spent on immediate subsistence. That does not mean these societies were effortlessly prosperous. It means they chose to devote energy to non-immediate yet socially meaningful projects, and that tells us such projects mattered. They were not optional decorations. They were central enough to justify work. This is often a clue that celestial order, seasonal timing, and communal ritual had already become woven tightly together. As societies grew larger and more settled, such calculations could become increasingly formal. Once agriculture deepens dependence on annual timing, the incentive to track cycles intensifies. A mobile group can adapt flexibly to changing signs. A settled farming community needs stronger expectations. Plant too early and seed fails. Plant too late and harvest suffers. Miss flood timing and everything becomes much harder very quickly. This is where stones, posts, sight lines, and horizon markers begin to shade toward calendar infrastructure. Not mechanical clocks in any modern sense, but fixed references through which the year can be read more reliably. And yet, the beauty of early calculation is that it never fully loses contact with the world being measured. Our own instruments often produce results in forms that can become detached from direct experience. A date on a screen tells you little about why the Earth feels a certain way unless you already know the larger system. Early markers did the opposite. They linked measure to perception. Stand here, watch there, see the change. The calculation remained visible. One might say these were educational structures as much as observational ones. They taught people how to see. That may be one of the most profound things ancient stone arrangements did. They trained attention across generations. You do not build an aligned structure only to use it once. You build it to return to gather at, to point from, to show younger members of the group what matters and when. The structure becomes a tutor in recurrence. Even if later meanings accumulate around it, that pedagogical role can remain. In this sense, stone preserves not just information, but a mode of looking. It tells the body where to stand and where to aim its awareness. The phrase silent calculations captures this rather well, because silence here does not mean absence of thought. It means thought embedded so fully in space that it no longer needs explanation every time. A doorway angled to catch light, a pillar placed at a boundary of sunrise, a sequence of posts recording movement through the year. These are calculations that do not announce themselves in words, yet they continue to operate. They are like music written into the layout of land, invisible while idle, obvious when the moment arrives. Of course, not every ancient observer needed stone. Some calculations would have lived in gesture, memory, and repeated experience alone. A person can measure a shadow with the body, count nights between phases, use fingers for intervals, compare a rising point against a tree or distant hill, or track recurrence through song and ritual. The durable monuments we still see are only the surviving tips of a much broader world of temporary or intangible practices. This should make us careful. The archaeological record overrepresents what lasts. Stone survives. Wood rarely does. Earthworks fade. Voices disappear. The absence of evidence for a method is not evidence that no method existed. That caution matters because it keeps us from underrating ancient complexity. By the time the first cities appear, humans had already spent immense spans of time experimenting with ways to anchor and communicate pattern. Settlement did not create calculation from nowhere. It gave existing habits new scale, new urgency, and new institutional support. A city can gather specialists. It can assign labour. It can protect important sites, or appropriate them, or place new ones at the centre of power. It can turn communal memory into official system. But beneath all that lies a much older practice of looking, marking, correcting, and returning. This is why some ancient monuments feel older than their stones. They belong to traditions of attention that may have stretched back long before the visible structure was raised. A temple alignment may inherit the significance of an earlier ritual site. A city axis may preserve a horizon relationship known to communities that lived there before the city existed. A sacred precinct may formalize a landscape already recognized as meaningful. The visible construction is sometimes the latest layer, not the first. When civilization arrives, it does not necessarily invent the line between stone and star. Often it institutionalizes it. And institutions, once involved, change the scale of calculation dramatically. A local marker becomes part of a larger calendar. An observational tradition becomes priestly authority. A horizon event becomes a state ritual. With that shift, knowledge can become more exact in some ways and more political in others. To know the proper day for planting, taxing, sacrificing, or proclaiming order is powerful. If heaven's pattern can be read, the people who claim to read it acquire influence. This is one reason early astronomy, religion, and governance become so tightly braided. The silent calculations of earlier communities are not abandoned. They are absorbed into systems of rule. Still, before they become instruments of power, they remain something much simpler and perhaps more beautiful. evidence that humans wanted not just to live through time, but to place themselves within it carefully. They wanted to know where they stood when the world turned. They wanted to anticipate, to orient, to remember correctly. Stones were part of that effort because stones could stand where bodies could not always remain. They could hold a line through generations. What fascinates me most is that these calculations were both intellectually demanding and emotionally reassuring. To mark the return of the sun or the turning point of the year is to prove that chaos has edges. Winter deepens, but not forever. Darkness lengthens, but there is a limit. The sun wanders, but within bounds. Such knowledge is practical, yes, but it is also existentially stabilizing. Communities could gather around a structure and know that what seemed to vanish would return. This may help explain why so many early alignments sit close to ritual, burial, or collective memory. Calculation and meaning were never strangers. And once you have markers that can capture return, you're only one step away from something even more consequential. A line in stone that catches the sun on a certain day is not yet a full calendar, but it is already a piece of one. A repeated shadow is not yet official timekeeping, but it is a beginning. A horizon marker tied to seasonal change is not yet an organized year, but it points toward one. In other words, once people have learned to fix celestial events into place, the next development is almost waiting for them. The sky is no longer just something observed, it is becoming something counted. The sky is no longer just something observed, it is becoming something counted. That is a much bigger change than it may sound, because the difference between watching a recurring event and organizing life around it is the difference between curiosity and infrastructure. Once a community begins to rely on the heavens not only for wonder, orientation, or ritual significance, but for timing in the practical sense, the sky starts doing work. It tells people when to prepare, when to gather, when to plant, when to expect flood or dry season, when to begin ceremonies, when to count dews, when to move animals, when to look for signs that one cycle is ending and another is beginning. In other words, the sky becomes a clock long before anyone builds what we would call a clock. That should probably make us a little more careful with the word time, because modern people often imagine time as something delivered by devices. Watches, phones, alarms, calendars, timers, schedules, countdowns, notifications. We have made time into something external, segmented and slightly bossy. It vibrates in our pockets and politely informs us that we are late. Early human societies lived in a very different arrangement. They did not lack time, obviously. They lacked our machinery for packaging it. What they had instead was recurrence. Dawn, dusk, moon phase, season, flood, harvest, migration, shadow length, star rise, star set. These were not metaphors for time. They were time as lived reality. That distinction matters. A clock in the ancient sense was not originally a separate object placed against the world. It was the world read in a disciplined way. The sky became a clock when people learned to trust that it could regulate expectation. Once that trust exists, human life can be organized at much greater scale. Small groups can coordinate more effectively. Settled communities can time agricultural labor. Religious authority can attach itself to predicted celestial events. Rulers can present themselves as guardians of order because they claim to understand and maintain the proper relation between human action and cosmic rhythm. The humble act of counting days and watching horizons turns out to be one of the foundations of civilization. And civilization, by this point in our story, is beginning to need that foundation badly. A mobile community can respond flexibly to signs as they come. A village can do the same, at least for a while. But once populations grow and settlement deepens, uncertainty becomes more expensive. Planting too early or too late affects not just a household, but a larger system of labour and expectation. Rituals tied to season matter more when they reinforce social cohesion in communities that are no longer small enough for everyone to know everything directly. Storage, irrigation, taxation, and hierarchy all benefit from reliable timing. This is where celestial observation stops being merely useful and becomes central. The easiest cycle to begin with is the day itself. Day and night are obvious, but even obvious things can become more informative when watched closely. The sun's movement gives direction. Its height gives a rough sense of time passing. Shadows lengthen and shorten in dependable ways. Once people begin to notice that shadow can measure change across a single day, a new possibility opens. Not full precision in the modern sense, of course. Nobody in early Mesopotamia was anxiously checking whether it was 3:17 and wondering why the meeting had not started. But there is still a practical difference between early morning, mid-morning, noon, late afternoon and dusk, especially in a world where labour, heat, visibility, prayer and administration all matter. A stick in the ground is enough to begin. Watch its shadow shorten, turn, lengthen. Repeat that over many days and seasons and you begin to understand both the day's arc and the year's changes. This is one of the most elegant features of ancient timekeeping. The same observation can serve multiple scales at once. A shadow tells you the time of day, but over months it also tells you that the sun's path has shifted. That means daily time and yearly time are connected in a way that becomes visible to anyone patient enough to notice. Early people did not need separate departments for these things. The sky handled the integration itself. Then there is the moon, which may have been humanity's first really persuasive recurring calendar. The moon changes shape in a sequence that is easy to see and short enough to track without heroic levels of patience. That makes it socially useful. If people are gathering, travelling, hunting at night, fishing with tidal awareness in some regions, or timing rituals, the moon provides a ready framework. You can count from new moon to full moon and back again. You can anticipate darkness or brightness. You can structure recurring events around visible phases. This kind of timekeeping feels very natural because it is present to the eye. You do not need calculation in the later formal sense to know that the moon is keeping a pattern. Many early societies understandably leaned heavily on lunar time. Months as a concept likely owe much of their practical origin to the moon cycle. Even today the echo remains in language and in the structure of many traditional calendars. But the moon comes with a complication that must have amused and annoyed ancient observers in roughly equal measure. Lunar cycles do not fit neatly into the solar year. 12 lunar months fall short of the full seasonal cycle. That means if you follow the moon alone, your calendar drifts against the seasons. A feast once held in spring will slide backward. A planting time tied only to lunar months will eventually stop matching the ground. The sky, in other words, can be trusted, but it does not always simplify your life. This is one of the moments when sky watching becomes real intellectual labour. To live by both moon and sun is to confront a problem of coordination. You need months because they are easy to see and count. You need the year because agriculture and season insist on it. You need a way to reconcile them. Later civilizations solved this in different ways, with intercalary months, adjustments, priestly observation, and calendar reforms. But even before formal systems appear, the problem itself teaches something important. Time is patterned, but not all patterns line up cleanly. The heavens are orderly, yet they ask for interpretation. That is exactly the sort of challenge that creates specialists, and specialists begin to matter the moment timing becomes social rather than personal. In a small group, everyone can more or less know when the moon is full or when a certain star rises. In a large settled society, official timing brings power. Someone must decide when the year begins, when rites should occur, when planting is due, when taxes or offerings are expected, when work crews assemble, when the flood is late enough to worry about. Knowledge of celestial order becomes practical authority. This is why early priests, astronomer observers, and administrators often seem entangled. They were dealing with the same thing from different sides. To keep the calendar was to keep part of the society itself. This is especially clear in river civilizations. Along the Nile, for instance, the annual flood was not a vague seasonal mood. It was the organizing event around which agricultural life turned. Egyptian observers paid close attention to the heliacal rising of Sirius, the bright star whose appearance just before sunrise was associated with the coming inundation. That is a beautiful example of the sky becoming a clock in the full civilizational sense. A star is no longer merely a point of light. It is a signal tied to the behavior of water, land, food, labour and ritual. The heavens announce what the earth is about to do. Once that relationship is recognised and relied upon, timing becomes predictive rather than merely descriptive. Mesopotamia offers a similar seriousness, though with its own flavour. In the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, timing mattered for agriculture, labour and administration in ways that encourage systematic observation. The people of early cities such as Uruk and later Babylonian scholars developed increasingly sophisticated methods for tracking celestial cycles. But what matters for our question is not just the later sophistication, it is the continuity behind it. By the time scribes begin recording celestial observations, the sky has already been functioning as public time for generations. Writing does not create the clock. It preserves and refines a clock already in use, and when writing enters, it changes the game. A remembered pattern can now be compared against records. Observations can accumulate beyond the lifespan of one observer. Corrections can become more exact. Calendar systems can become formal enough to govern large populations. This is a major leap, but it is built on older foundations of looking, counting, and trusting recurrence. A written calendar is powerful because the unwritten world had already taught people that the sky was dependable enough to deserve one. Dependable, however, does not mean simple. In fact, one of the strangest and most revealing parts of ancient timekeeping is how much effort it required. Modern people often imagine that clocks simplify life. Ancient cosmic clocks did the opposite before they simplified anything. They demanded constant attention. Is the new moon truly visible yet? Has the seasonal star risen at the expected moment? Are we drifting out of alignment with the agricultural year? Did clouds obscure the observation? Should a correction be made? The sky was stable in the long run, but daily and monthly use of it involved interpretation. In that sense, the first clocks were not machines that ran automatically. They were relationships maintained by trained people. This is worth dwelling on because it means time itself was once more communal. We tend to experience time privately. My phone tells me the hour. Your watch tells you yours. We synchronize because devices agree. Ancient societies synchronized because communities were taught to agree on signs and because certain people held the responsibility of reading them correctly. There is something more fragile in that, but also something more social. The beginning of the month might depend on observed moonlight. The beginning of the year might depend on a star or a flood, or a ritual declaration tied to both. Time arrived through shared attention, not anonymous circuitry. The daily division of time likely grew in similar ways. Once labour becomes organised, once temples and courts and work crews and trade schedules matter, societies benefit from finer subdivisions. Egypt eventually used daylight and night watches in ways tied to the stars and to water clocks. Mesopotamia developed numerical systems that influenced later divisions of hours and minutes. None of this happened instantly, and much of it belongs to later refinement rather than the earliest threshold, but the direction is clear. The sky first provides broad rhythm. Human institutions then carve that rhythm into more manageable units. That is a familiar pattern in history. Nature offers continuity, and civilization responds by segmenting it. Yet even as time grows more segmented, ancient timekeeping never fully leaves the body or the environment. Morning is still cooler, noon is still overhead brightness and short shadow. The evening star is still visible, the flood still comes or fails to come, the year is still known through grain, mud, heat, wind, and river, as much as through formal count. This integration may be one of the great differences between ancient and modern time. We experience schedule as something often detached from season. Ancient people may have experienced schedule as a more explicit negotiation between celestial order and earthly consequence. That gives the phrase, "the sky became a clock," a slightly richer meaning. It was not only that people measured the heavens, it was that they let heavenly recurrence regulate life here below. They made social promises based on it. They built expectation into institutions. They trusted it enough to synchronize work, worship, and memory. A festival is not just a party when tied to celestial timing. It is a public renewal of order. Planting is not just agriculture when placed within a calendar tied to sky signs. It is participation in a larger rhythm. The beginning of the year is not only accounting, it is a statement about where a people believe themselves to stand in the pattern of things. This may also explain why calendar reform and timekeeping often became politically sensitive. If the official calendar drifts, authority is embarrassed. If priests disagree about timing, ritual order is shaken. If rulers claim that cosmic harmony supports their reign, they have strong reason to maintain the appearance of accurate alignment. In some societies, astronomically informed timekeeping became a way of demonstrating legitimacy. To govern well was in part to keep human action in step with celestial order. That sounds lofty, but it had very practical roots. A ruler who could not maintain the timing of flood, planting, taxation and ritual would soon discover that cosmic symbolism is much less persuasive when the granaries are empty. There is another quieter consequence of this transition. Once the sky becomes a clock, history itself changes shape. Or rather, people begin to feel more keenly that events happen in a counted sequence. Before formal calendars, recurrence dominates. After calendars, recurrence remains, but it can now be indexed. This happened in the third year of a king. This offering was made in the month after inundation began. This omen appeared on such and such day. Civilization becomes able not only to live in cycles, but to record them in ordered relation. Time remains circular in many rituals and seasonal patterns, but it also acquires a more linear administrative face. The sky helps create both. That duality never really goes away. Even now, we live in both kinds of time whether we admit it or not. We have linear schedules, deadlines, fiscal years, birthdays, and progress charts. But we also have winter, spring, migration, menstrual cycles, sleep, sunlight, harvest, and the lingering sense that some parts of life return no matter what our planners say. Ancient people may have felt that duality more directly, because their clocks were still visibly tied to cycles in nature. They were not freed from recurrence by measurement. They were made more aware of it, and there may be something else here that we have partly lost. When time is learned from the sky, it carries location with it. The horizon matters, the season matters. The star rises here, not nowhere. The flood belongs to this river, the harvest to this soil. Time is not fully abstract. It is local as well as cosmic. Modern clocks erase that. Noon on a display looks much the same anywhere, and standardization smooths out differences that older communities would have felt directly. This is useful for trains, aviation, and international conference calls, but it also creates the strange impression that time floats above place. Ancient timekeeping would have resisted that. The sky may be shared, but its meaning was always read from somewhere. That somewhere becomes especially important when societies start building architecture around time. Temples aligned to solstices, structures that track sunrise or shadow, ritual spaces arranged to catch celestial events, official calendars proclaimed from specific centers of power. The clock is no longer only overhead, it is built into cities. A society that can read the heavens begins to shape space so that time becomes visible in stone, avenue, doorway, and ritual route. And once that happens, Ordinary people do not need to understand every calculation. They can participate by gathering at the right place, at the right moment, to watch the world confirm what their society claims to know. This might be one of the reasons early timekeeping feels so grand in retrospect. It was not merely technical, it was theatrical in the deepest sense, not fake but staged. Light enters the chamber. The star appears when expected. The flood follows its sign. The year turns in public. These are demonstrations of intelligibility. They tell a people that the world can be read, that their ancestors learned something real, and that the institutions of the present stand in continuity with that knowledge. A clock on a wall tells you you're late. An ancient cosmic clock tells you your society belongs to an order larger than itself. Of course, things could go wrong. Floods vary, weather interferes, calendars drift, observers disagree, eclipses alarm, comets intrude like uninvited guests. The heavens are regular enough to trust, but irregular enough to remain uncanny. This tension may be one reason celestial timekeeping never becomes purely mechanical in the ancient imagination. The sky's a clock, yes, but also a source of signs. It governs routine, yet it can still surprise. That combination makes it both administratively useful and spiritually charged. Routine and omen live side by side, and from there, another step becomes almost inevitable. If the sky announces what should happen, people begin to listen more carefully to how the earth answers. The river rises or fails, the soil cracks or softens, the reeds thicken, the wind shifts. Water remembers the season in its own way, and the first great civilizations did not learn to count the heavens merely for the pleasure of counting. They did it because the land below was speaking back, especially in the places where everything depended on knowing when earth and water would change their mind. They did it because the land below was speaking back, especially in the places where everything depended on knowing when earth and water would change their mind. And for a very long time, before maps became precise, and before engineers arrived with confident diagrams and an admirable tendency to act as though rivers are salaried employees, human beings had to learn that language by living inside it. Not standing above it, not managing it from a distance, not reducing it to a single useful number on a chart, but watching it closely enough to recognize that the ground itself had habits. That may sound obvious. Of course, the ground has habits. Rivers flood, soil dries, coastlines shift, springs fail, marshes spread, rains come early or late. But there is a difference between knowing, in a general modern sense, that landscapes change, and reading those changes the way early settled communities had to. In the oldest agricultural civilizations, earth and water were not scenery. They were timing systems, warning systems, memory systems, and in many cases the entire basis of survival. If the first civilization knew something we do not, this may be one of the strongest candidates. They may have known how to read environmental change at the human scale with a depth of fluency that industrial societies have repeatedly traded away. That fluency would not have appeared all at once, and it certainly would not have belonged only to elites. Priests may have watched the stars, scribes may have recorded measures, rulers may have claimed cosmic alignment, but a culture's understanding of land and water is usually distributed much more widely. Farmers know when the soil holds too much moisture. Fishers know the feel of changing current. Herdsmen know where ground remains firm after rain. Builders know which earth cracks, which settles, which takes weight badly. Women drawing water know the taste and level of wells over time. Children learn when not to step after flood season unless they would like a very memorable afternoon. This kind of knowledge is local, cumulative and practical. It often does not look grand from the outside, yet whole societies depend on it, and water, more than almost anything else, trains attention. It is useful, generous, dangerous, patient, and deeply unwilling to be fully controlled. You can channel it, store it, divert it, worship it, fear it, and write songs about it, but it will still keep reminding you that it follows the shape of the world better than you do. Early river civilizations learned this very quickly. The first cities did not emerge in random places. They clustered where water made dense life possible, though not always easy. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, and many lesser waterways shaped the conditions for settlement, agriculture, trade, risk, and memory. To live there successfully required more than simple access to water. It required understanding variation. Variation is the part modern summaries often flatten. We are taught that early civilizations grew up around rivers because rivers provided fertile land and irrigation, which is true as far as it goes, in the same way that saying ships float because they are on water is technically correct but leaves out the interesting parts. Rivers are not static gifts. They meander, branch, silt up, erode banks, change channels, flood unpredictably or with rough regularity, leave rich sediment in one year and destruction in another. A river valley offers abundance, but abundance only helps if people learn the terms on which it arrives. The language of earth and water is precisely that set of terms. Take floodplains. A floodplain is not merely a flat place that gets wet sometimes. It is a memory field. Layer after layer of deposited silt records repeated interaction between land and water. Ancient people did not speak in modern geological vocabulary, but they did not need to in order to recognize what mattered. Fresh silt meant fertility. Certain flood marks meant danger or promise. Soil texture underfoot meant one kind of crop would thrive and another would sulk dramatically. The smell of wet ground, the thickness of deposited mud, the timing of retreating waters, the places where reeds returned first, the low areas that remained soft longest, the channels that carried water after the main flood withdrew, all of these were readable signs. They told people what sort of year might be unfolding. This is where the old habit of underestimating ancient practical intelligence becomes especially unhelpful. We tend to admire monumental remains because they are obvious. A ziggurat still stands. A canal line can be traced. A temple alignment catches the imagination. But much of the real genius of early civilizations may have lived in more ordinary perception, knowing how to read moisture by the look of soil, knowing which ground cracks after too much salt, knowing that the river's colour has changed in a way that means upstream rain, knowing how the birds are behaving near marsh edges, knowing that a certain plant appearing along the bank means water has lingered beneath the surface longer than expected. These are not quaint rustic details. They are data gathered by attention and tested by consequence. And unlike many modern forms of data, this kind was not neatly isolated from daily life. It had to be lived with. If a flood was late, people felt it in worry before they recorded it in any official way. If the ground retained too much water, they felt it in labour. If salinity crept into fields, they saw it in crop decline and tasted some part of it on the land itself. Long before there were agricultural reports, there were communities asking one another versions of the same urgent question. Does the earth still seem right this year? That question implies something very important. Early people likely understood that the land had a normal range of behaviour. Not perfect regularity, but a recognisable character. The river tends to do this. The soil usually behaves like that after a wet season. The marsh extends this far in most years. The wells drop at this point in the dry months. The fish come when the current changes in a particular way. Once you know a place well enough, deviation becomes legible. Modern systems often require instruments to detect what local memory once noticed directly. There are obvious advantages to instruments, and I'm in no hurry to replace hydrology with a single elderly man narrowing his eyes at a riverbank and declaring the year questionable. But it is still worth noticing that place-based knowledge once gave communities a much more intimate baseline. Earth, too, was not passive in this arrangement. Soil carries the history of water, plants, labour and use. Ancient farmers knew that land could be tired, that some plots gave well and others poorly, that flooding could renew and also ruin, that irrigation helped until it harmed. Mesopotamia in particular teaches a difficult lesson here. Irrigation made large-scale agriculture possible in an environment where rainfall alone was unreliable, but over time it could also contribute to salinization, especially in poorly drained soils under hot conditions. This is a wonderfully humbling reminder that civilization's triumphs often come with long-term invoices. Early people may not have described salt accumulation in chemistry terms, but they did observe that some fields changed, some crops fared worse, and management had consequences across years. That too is part of the language of earth and water, knowing that what helps now may alter the land later. Once you start looking through that lens, a great deal of early ritual and symbolism begins to seem less mysterious. Water is sacred in many cultures, not because people were irrationally sentimental about rivers, but because water was life, uncertainty, cleansing, danger, fertility, transport, and political power all in one. Springs, wells, river crossings, marsh boundaries, and floodwaters were not just practical features. They were places where the invisible terms of survival became visible. It would be surprising if people had not attached deep meaning to them. Sacred language often gathers around what a society cannot afford to misunderstand. The same is true of earth. Soil is not glamorous, which is perhaps why modern people overlook it until food prices rise, or a garden dies unexpectedly. But to early civilizations, soil was a living ledger of success and failure. Too dry, and seeds struggled. Too wet, and roots rotted. Too compact, and labour increased. Too salty, and yield fell. Good soil was wealth in a literal recurring sense. It is not hard to see why fertility deities, agricultural rites, and seasonal observances grew around these realities. The ground fed people, but only if they kept listening. There is another layer here that matters if we are asking what may have been lost. The language of earth and water is never entirely universal. Some principles travel, yes, but much of it is local dialect. A community beside the Nile learns one rhythm. A community in southern Mesopotamia learns another. An Indus city, dealing with monsoon patterns, river shifts, and urban drainage, learns yet another. A coastal settlement reads tides and estuaries differently from an inland irrigation society. This local specificity means that knowledge had to be anchored in place and transmitted through repeated experience. It could not be imported perfectly as a general rulebook. That makes it powerful, but also vulnerable. Disrupt the continuity of community, and the knowledge thins quickly. That may be one reason collapses and upheavals can be so devastating. When cities fall or populations move, we often think first of lost monuments, lost texts, lost political order. But there can also be a quieter loss, the breakdown of local environmental fluency. The people who knew exactly how this channel behaved, when this floodplain became safe, which field needed rest, which path stayed dry, which well turned bad first in drought, may be displaced, dead, absorbed, or ignored. A later society may inherit the land but not the same intimacy with it. And once that continuity breaks, rebuilding it takes time. This is not merely an ancient problem. We have done versions of this repeatedly. Wetlands drained because they seemed useless, only to discover later that they buffered flood and supported entire ecologies. Rivers straightened to improve efficiency, then found to be far less cooperative than promised. Local farming knowledge dismissed in favour of centralised schemes that work beautifully in reports and less beautifully in actual weather. Coastal building carried out with immense confidence in places that older communities knew were never truly stable. The old language of earth and water has been mistranslated many times, often by people with excellent credentials and disappointing patience. Still, early civilizations may have held that language more fully because they had no choice. If your city depends on irrigation canals, you must understand gradient, seepage, blockage, silt, and timing. If your food relies on a seasonal inundation, you must know when water is beneficial and when it overstays its welcome. If your settlement sits in a floodplain, You must recognise subtle elevation differences that determine which district remains dry and which becomes a problem discussed by future archaeologists with great sympathy. This is engineering in the broad human sense, but it begins with observation before it becomes design. Canals are a particularly good example. To make irrigation work, ancient societies had to understand not only where water was, but how it moved through land. That means slope, soil absorption, sediment load, maintenance, and collective labour. A canal is not just a ditch with ambitions, it is a social agreement written into earth. It must be cleared, managed, repaired, and defended from the natural tendency of water either to escape or to deposit half a river inside it. Successful irrigation civilizations were not only moving water, they were participating in a continuous argument with terrain. The fact that some did this at large scale for long periods is not evidence of domination over nature so much as evidence of ongoing negotiation. And negotiation is exactly the right word. Ancient people did not simply command the environment, but neither were they passive. They altered landscapes substantially. They built levees, channels, reservoirs, terraces, embankments, drainage systems, and urban waterworks. The Indus cities, for example, are often admired for their planning and drainage, and rightly so. Their streets and water management suggest a society paying close attention to flow, cleanliness, and perhaps seasonal risk. Egypt's basin irrigation depended on reading the Nile's behaviour and organising labour accordingly. Mesopotamian canal systems required maintenance and governance that blurred the line between hydrology and politics. These are not the achievements of people vaguely close to nature. They are the achievements of people who paid disciplined attention to earth and water because their lives were built on them. But there is a danger in romanticising that attention too much. Ancient societies also made mistakes, overextended systems, strained landscapes, and suffered from environmental change they could not control. Drought, shifting river courses, erosion, salinity, and political instability all played roles in different regions at different times. Listening to the land does not grant immunity from disaster. It only improves your chances of noticing trouble before it becomes irreversible. Sometimes even that is not enough. Rivers move, climates shift, monsoon patterns change, tectonics lift, crack, and alter drainage. The world remains larger than any civilization's reading of it. Even so, reading matters. One of the most haunting possibilities in all this is that early civilizations may have understood not only the use of land and water, but their mood, their tendency, their memory, not as mystical beings with emotions, but as systems with character. This river rises quickly after distant rain. That one leaves rich soil but punishes overconfidence. This plain retains standing water in low years. That marsh signals groundwater below. This wind brings dust before dry months. These subtle environmental signatures form a kind of language because they can be interpreted, responded to, and shared. Lose the interpretation and the signs remain, but they become mute. Modern life is full of such muting. We still live on land shaped by water, but many of us encounter that truth only when something goes wrong enough to reach the news. A neighbourhood floods because it was built on an old floodplain whose memory survived only in forgotten maps and the occasional suspiciously swampy backyard. A drought reveals which regions had been overpromising themselves for decades. A heat wave exposes the difference between living with climate and building as though climate were an optional decorative layer. Ancient people would not have solved all our problems, and many would be baffled by our plumbing in quite a reasonable way. But they might recognise our recurring habit of mistaking temporary control for understanding. There is also something else the language of earth and water teaches, and it is that boundaries are rarely as clean as human systems prefer. River and field bleed into one another, land and season cross. Dry and wet are relative conditions, not eternal categories. Ancient societies had to be comfortable with thresholds because thresholds were where they lived. The edge of floodwater, the point at which fertile mud becomes standing hazard, the moment a canal helps rather than harms, the part of the year when marshland is productive and the part when it is treacherous. Civilizations built in such places were never truly separate from environmental process. They were braided into it. That may explain why so many early myths and political symbols involve emergence from water, order wrestled from flood, kingship tied to fertility, or divine power expressed through rivers and rain. These are not random story preferences. They reflect worlds in which social life depended on reading unstable but recurring transitions. A king who claimed to guarantee order was, in practical terms, claiming to help hold society steady against the uncertainty of earth and water. A temple that sanctified flood and harvest was not indulging in decorative theology. It was linking human dependence to cosmic meaning in a way people could feel in their fields. And perhaps that is part of what has been lost. Not some single technical secret, but an entire habit of respect grounded in familiarity. Early civilizations knew that land and water could not be reduced to backdrop. They were partners, constraints, and sometimes judges. That did not make ancient societies gentle. They were often harsh, exploitative, and hungry for control. But their closeness to environmental process may have left less room for the illusion that human intention alone determined outcomes. The river had a vote, the soil had a vote, the season had a vote. Ignore them, and the correction arrived without delay. Which brings us back to the first cities. By the time urban life thickened around temples, granaries, canals, and walls, people were not merely occupying a landscape. They were inheriting generations of environmental listening. The city was new, but the conversation with land and water was old. Streets, storage, authority, and record-keeping all rested on prior knowledge of flood, silt, slope, drainage, fertility, and seasonal return. In that sense, the first cities may not only have been built beside rivers, they may have been built out of remembered answers to what rivers and soils had been saying for a very long time, and once enough of those answers were gathered into permanent form, something else became possible. Cities could begin to remember on purpose. Cities could begin to remember on purpose. That may be one of the strangest and most important things that happened when human beings first gathered into large permanent settlements, because memory had always existed before that. Families remembered, elders remembered, rituals remembered, landscapes remembered in their own slow way through worn paths, buried hearths, old field lines, flood deposits, and places returned to generation after generation. But the first cities did something new. They started building memory into walls, streets, temples, storage rooms, calendars, and administrative habits. They turned remembrance into infrastructure. That is a very modern-sounding sentence for a very ancient problem, but it fits rather well. A city cannot survive on improvisation for long. A camp can move. A village can lean heavily on personal familiarity. A city, once it reaches a certain size, needs systems that outlast the people currently using them. It needs to know when grain was stored, where water should go, how fields are measured, which gods are honoured on which days, who owes what, where labour is assigned, which route a procession follows, where the dead belong, how long since the river rose properly, which gate opens to which road, and what happened the last time something went terribly wrong. The first cities did not merely collect people. They collected repeated solutions to recurring problems, and then they tried to keep those solutions alive. In that sense, the earliest urban centres may have remembered more than later generations tend to notice. Not always in written form, though writing eventually becomes central. Sometimes they remembered through layout, sometimes through ritual, sometimes through architecture arranged so that a season, a direction, or a social order became impossible to ignore. A city plan can be memory. A temple axis can be memory. A canal maintained along an old line can be memory. Even a wall, if it marks the place where people once learned the hard way where protection was needed, is memory wearing stone. This is one reason the first cities feel so difficult to read from a modern distance. We look at ruins and tend to ask what each structure was for, as though function comes in neat separate boxes. Granary, temple, house, street, drain, administrative building. The people living there may not have divided things so cleanly. A temple was religious, obviously, but it could also be economic, calendrical, political and archival. A street was for movement, but also for procession, trade, social display and orientation. A storage space was practical, but it also held the community's future and perhaps its sense of whether order was still working. The first cities were full of places that did more than one thing at once, because remembering itself is rarely tidy. Take the city of Uruk, often called one of the world's earliest true cities. By the 4th millennium BCE it had grown into something astonishing for its time. Monumental architecture, large population, temple complexes, organised labour, and the earliest stages of writing. But long before writing becomes literature, before kings are wrapped in narrative grandeur, the city is already behaving like a memory device. Goods are counted, transactions are marked, space is formalised, authority is centred, ritual is repeated. The same complexes are rebuilt, expanded and elevated over older layers, as though the city is stacking its own past under its present and refusing to start from scratch. That layering is literal in archaeology, of course, but it is also intellectual. Early cities did not erase yesterday if they could help it. They built on it, sometimes to an almost obsessive degree. Egypt offers a slightly different version of the same instinct. Settlement there was shaped by the Nile's regularity in ways that made memory especially valuable. If a river returns in a broad seasonal rhythm, society can begin to organise itself around expectation with unusual confidence. Nilometers, basin systems, stored grain, ritual calendars, and state authority all depend on remembering what the river tends to do and what happens when it does not. Egyptian civilization becomes famous for continuity, and not by accident. It placed an extraordinary amount of energy into preserving names, forms, alignments, and ritual repetition. Tombs remembered, temples remembered, the flood remembered. Kingship itself was a machine for continuity, constantly presenting present rule as the proper renewal of an established order. When we admire the visual stability of Egyptian forms across centuries, we are also looking at a civilization deeply committed to remembering how things are supposed to be. The Indus Valley gives us another case, and perhaps the most quietly intriguing one. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show remarkable planning, standardization, drainage, and regularity, even though we still cannot read their script with confidence. That alone makes them tantalizing. It is like walking into a room and seeing all the filing cabinets carefully labelled in a language you cannot understand. The organisation is obvious, the inner commentary is not. Yet the urban fabric itself suggests memory at work. Standardised brick proportions, repeated urban features, careful drainage, water management, and consistent planning across sites imply shared practices that were taught, preserved, and enforced over time. These cities remembered how to build and how to govern water, even if the exact words they use for that knowledge remain locked away from us, and perhaps that is the key. The first cities may have remembered not just facts but procedures, how to do things again, how to bring order out of repetition, how to turn annual uncertainty into organised response. Modern memory often means information stored for retrieval. Ancient urban memory was often more like a recipe that had to be performed. Open the canals, mark the flood, rebuild the embankment, begin the festival, measure the field, call the labourers, offer to the gods, seal the storage, record the count, clean the drains, bury the dead correctly, teach the children where the procession goes and why. A city that does these things year after year is not only surviving, it is rehearsing itself. This is where ritual becomes especially important, and not merely as religion in the narrow sense. Ritual is one of the oldest and most effective technologies of memory ever developed. Do the same action, the same way at the same time and place. and a community carries knowledge forward with astonishing resilience. That knowledge may include social hierarchy, seasonal timing, sacred narratives, environmental awareness, and practical cooperation all at once. A procession route through a city can preserve orientation, political order, and communal identity. An annual rite tied to flood, harvest, or solstice can preserve environmental timing under sacred form. A burial custom can preserve beliefs about ancestry, land, and legitimacy. We often read ritual as symbolic after the fact. For the people doing it, it was also mnemonic. The first cities, then, may have remembered the world through repetition, long before they fully explained it through text. In fact, text may originally have served repetition rather than replacing it. Early writing in Mesopotamia begins in highly practical contexts. Lists, accounts, goods, measures, obligations. This can look dull if you're hoping for immediate philosophical brilliance, but it is much more profound than it seems. The earliest writing does not begin with poetry, because cities first needed memory that would not argue, forget, die, or become conveniently selective. If 10 jars of oil were stored, someone wanted tomorrow's official to know there were 10 jars of oil, not about 10 or perhaps 8, unless Cousin Aram borrowed one and forgot to mention it. Administrative writing is the city deciding that some forms of memory must become harder to bend. And once that happens, urban memory becomes sturdier but also more concentrated. The people who can write, count, measure, and interpret records gain influence. Memory moves from being held mostly in distributed human practice to being partly held in institutions. This is not a total replacement. Oral tradition, ritual, embodied knowledge, and local familiarity remain enormously important. But cities now begin to remember in layers. The scribe remembers differently from the farmer. The temple remembers differently from the canal worker. The wall remembers differently from the song. Civilization becomes a dense braid of memory forms. That density may be one reason early cities appear so stable from a distance, even when they were often vulnerable, noisy, and full of strain. A city can look permanent because it preserves continuity in many places at once. The built environment holds one part, officials hold another, priests another, families another, craft traditions another. If one strand weakens, others may compensate for a while. This is probably one reason large early societies can survive shocks better than we sometimes expect. They are not relying on one memory channel. They are surrounded by reminders of how life is meant to proceed. But what exactly were they trying to remember? That is where the question becomes especially interesting. Some things are obvious enough. They remembered agricultural timing. They remembered how to manage water. They remembered property, obligations, lineage, rank, and ritual order. They remembered where authority sat and how it presented itself. Yet there may have been more than that. The first cities may also have remembered a much older relationship to place, sky, and season inherited from the pre-urban world we have already been tracing. It is easy to imagine the rise of cities as a break with older ways, and in some respects it was. Urban life changes attention. It introduces specialists, officials, stored surplus, social distance, and increasingly complex systems of control. Still, the first cities were not built by people who had forgotten the older world entirely. Many of their practices likely came straight out of much older traditions. Their calendars probably preserved observations made long before writing. Their sacred centres may have formalised places already considered meaningful. Their agricultural routines rested on inherited environmental fluency. Their myths may have compressed long communal memories into narratives that became official once temples and states took interest. This may explain why so many ancient cities place great emphasis on foundations. Foundation deposits, founding myths, sacred centres, ancestral legitimacy, and repeated rebuilding all suggest that the beginning mattered enormously. Not because these people were sentimental in our modern sense, but because continuity was authority. To say, "We have done this before," is one of the strongest possible claims a city can make. We are not improvising. We stand where our predecessors stood. The temple rises where it rose before. The gods were honoured here already. The king renews, not invents. The canal follows the old line. The year begins as it should. These are statements of memory, and they are also statements of power. This is perhaps most visible in the relationship between temple and city. In many early societies, temples were not merely houses for gods. They were centres of storage, labour, redistribution, timing and legitimacy. The sacred and the practical met there because both relied on ordered continuity. If the temple knows the proper festival dates, if it receives goods, if it oversees land, if it keeps records, if it stages public rites, then it is acting as one of the city's central remembering organs. The divine aspect is not separate from this. On the contrary, it strengthens it. Sacred order makes memory harder to challenge. If the city's routines reflect the will of gods or the structure of the cosmos, then to deviate from them is not only inconvenient, it is dangerous. And yet, alongside all this official memory, early cities must also have held quieter recollections, memories of floodlines, of districts rebuilt after fire, of where the ground is less trustworthy, of which quarter smells different in late heat because drainage is poor, of old channels now buried beneath newer streets, of shrines older than the current temple, of ancestors who came from another settlement when the river changed. Cities are full of unofficial memory, and the earliest ones would have been no exception. In fact, those unofficial layers may have mattered enormously in how urban life actually functioned. One can imagine a first city as a place where memory is constantly negotiated between formal and lived forms. The state or temple says the flood will come thus, the labour is due then, the rite begins here. The people who work the land, watch the banks and move through the streets know the texture of local reality in more immediate ways. Sometimes those forms of memory reinforce each other, sometimes they strain. A city survives in part by keeping them close enough together that one does not entirely lose contact with the other. This may also be why early cities often seem so conservative. Repetition was not mere stubbornness, it was a survival strategy. Standard bricks, repeated plans, inherited routes, fixed rituals, measured fields, traditional offerings, conservative legal formulas, all of these reduce uncertainty. They allow a large society to coordinate without renegotiating everything from zero each year. In modern terms, we might call this bureaucracy, and we usually do so with a sigh. But in its earliest form, it was something rather admirable, the attempt to keep useful memory from dissolving under the pressure of scale. Of course, useful memory can harden into rigidity. A city that remembers too well may become unable to adapt. A tradition built to preserve order can outlast the conditions that made it sensible. A river shifts, a climate changes, a trade network breaks, and the old remembered solutions begin to fail. This is one of the tragedies woven through urban history. The same structures that allow continuity can make society slow to notice that continuity is no longer enough. Still, at the beginning, remembering was a triumph. It made complexity possible. There is also a subtler point here. The first cities may have remembered not only what worked, but what had once gone wrong. Flood stories, fire rituals, defensive walls, emergency storage, elevated platforms, redundant channels, and ceremonial appeals for divine favour all suggest societies deeply aware that order was fragile. A city that stores grain remembers hunger. A city that raises sacred and administrative buildings above lower ground remembers water. A city that records labour and goods remembers loss, theft, or shortage. A city that rebuilds after destruction remembers that destruction happens. Urban memory is often born from trouble, not comfort. That makes the surviving calm of ancient ruins a little deceptive. When we look at worn brick, straight drains and repeated plans, we are seeing the results of earlier anxiety made solid. Somebody learned that this needed to be done this way, probably because another way failed. Somebody remembered the flood, the collapse, the fire, the shortage, the invasion, the epidemic, or the year when the river behaved badly and no one was prepared. Cities are built out of hopes, certainly, but they are also built out of corrected mistakes, and if that is true, then the first cities may have remembered very old warnings indeed. The shift from village and seasonal settlement to large urban concentration must have carried risks that people sensed even if they could not always express them. Crowding changes disease. Dependence on stored surplus creates vulnerability. Centralized water systems can sustain life and spread disaster. Hierarchy can coordinate and exploit with equal ease. The first cities did not know all this in modern epidemiological or political terms, but they learned quickly that concentration requires vigilance. Many of their systems of order may have been answers to that realization. So perhaps what the first cities remembered was not one hidden truth, but a whole set of relationships that had to be kept alive at once. The sky's cycles, the river's moods, the soil's limits, the old ritual roots, the authority of ancestors, the proper count of goods, the danger of forgetting flood, famine, fire, or social disorder, the knowledge that large human gatherings do not hold together by accident. This would make the first city not merely a settlement, but a machine for keeping many kinds of memory running in parallel. And machines, even ancient human ones, can be overloaded. The more a city remembers, the more it must protect, renew, and perform. Calendar must match season. Ritual must match calendar. Storage must match expectation. Authority must match reality convincingly enough to retain trust. The walls must still stand. The drains must still drain. The records must still correspond to grain in an actual room somewhere, not just to optimistic numbers scratched by a hopeful clerk. Urban memory is powerful, but it is labour-intensive. It asks for constant maintenance, and maintenance is one of history's least glamorous and most essential arts. There is something almost poignant in that. The first cities may have believed, or at least acted as though they believed, that if enough was remembered properly, order could continue, that if flood, sky, field, temple, storehouse, and street were all kept in correct relation, the world would remain readable. It is an understandable hope. It's also the kind of hope history enjoys testing very severely, because sooner or later, in almost every region, something happens that exceeds the city's memory. A river shifts too far, a drought lasts too long, a fire spreads faster than expected, new enemies arrive, trade snaps, authority weakens. The old repetitions no longer restore what they once restored, and then the great urban confidence in remembered order begins to shake. Which is perhaps why, behind so many ancient foundation stories and renewal rituals, there is a quiet fear humming in the background. Not just fear of death or defeat, but fear of forgetting. Fear that the lines will be lost, the rites mistimed, the channels neglected, the stores emptied, the names erased, the old warnings dismissed, the city's hard-won memory slipping away faster than anyone imagined. And once that fear enters the story, the next step is not difficult to see, because history is filled with moments when memory proves strong, right up until the day it met flood, fire, and the long beginning of forgetting. And once that fear enters the story, the next step is not difficult to see, because history is filled with moments when memory proves strong, right up until the day it met flood, fire, and the long beginning of forgetting. This is the part of the ancient world that people often either dramatize too much or flatten too neatly. On one side, you get the grand vanished civilization story, all doom, mystery, and meaningful wins over broken walls. On the other, you get the clinical summary, environmental stress, political fragmentation, resource pressure, migration, systemic decline. The clinical version is usually closer to the truth, but the dramatic one survives because collapse really does feel uncanny when viewed from a distance. A city that took centuries to build can become a ruin far more quickly than its own founders would ever have considered reasonable. A language can slip out of use, a river can move, a storage system can fail, a palace can burn, and with each of those events something more fragile than walls is endangered. Not just power, not just population, memory. It is tempting to imagine forgetting as a single event, like a library set ablaze or an army trampling a city gate. Sometimes it is sudden like that, or at least sudden enough for the people living through it. But more often, forgetting is gradual, layered, and awkwardly practical. The old canal is no longer maintained because the labour force has been diverted. The official ritual still takes place, but fewer people know what some of the gestures originally meant. A flood comes earlier than expected, then later the next year, then does not come in the same way at all. The city still remembers how things should be done, but the environment is beginning to answer in a different dialect. A palace archive burns, and with it go tax records, land measures, omen lists, contracts, astronomical observations, and the type of administrative detail no one finds romantic until it vanishes and takes a civilization's continuity with it. Forgetting is often less like a curtain falling, and more like tools disappearing from a workshop one by one, until the people left inside can still imitate the old routines but no longer repair them properly. Floods are especially cruel in this respect because they are both creators and destroyers of civilization. Water had always made the first cities possible. It nourished fields, refreshed floodplains, transported goods, and gave human settlement a recurring centre of gravity. Yet the same water could erase the very arrangements it had helped establish. A river that flooded within a familiar range was a partner. A river that shifted channel, rose too high, failed to rise, or cut into foundations became something else entirely. In Mesopotamia, river systems were both blessing and administrative headache, on a scale large enough to deserve their own mythology. The Tigris and Euphrates did not behave with the almost theatrical regularity of the Nile. They were more temperamental. Their courses shifted, their floods could be destructive, and irrigation required constant labour and coordination. This meant Mesopotamian civilization was highly productive, but also highly exposed to the long consequences of mismanaged water, environmental change, and political breakdown. When we think about flood in ancient history, it is easy to focus on the immediate damage. Fields destroyed, walls softened, houses collapsed, grain stores ruined, disease spread. Those were all real enough, and no one living through them needed a narrator to explain why soaked mud brick is bad for architecture. But flooding also attacks memory more subtly. It blurs boundaries that had been made meaningful. It wipes out field markers. It changes channels and therefore routes. It deposits silt where streets once ran. It erases the visible evidence of why a settlement was laid out a certain way. A city can rebuild after flood, but if rebuilding happens under pressure, with altered labour patterns and strained institutions, details are lost. The rebuilt version may resemble the old one, and yet already be forgetting what the old one knew. There is a strange irony there. The same silt that renews fertility can cover the traces of previous order. Archaeologists spend a great deal of time dealing with precisely this problem, peeling back layers in places where repeated inundation and rebuilding have blurred sequence. Ancient people must have dealt with it too, though with less concern for future excavation reports, and more concern for whether the storehouse wall would stop dissolving. A floodplain civilization lives with the knowledge that what makes land rich also makes it unstable as a record. If memory is not actively maintained in practice, ritual, and administration, the earth itself will not preserve it out of kindness. Fire works differently. Flood overwhelms by movement and saturation. Fire strips away concentration. It takes the built forms through which memory is often held and turns them into ash, collapse, and sudden discontinuity. This matters especially in societies where institutions have begun storing memory in central places. Palaces, temple archives, administrative buildings, storerooms, workshops. Once cities are built around accumulated goods and records, fire becomes not only a local disaster, but a civilizational insult. A burned archive is more than a building loss. It is a severed thread between past and present. This is one reason the destruction layers of ancient cities can feel so disturbing. Archaeologists uncover blackened beams, scorched brick, shattered vessels, abandoned tools, and the unnerving evidence of lives interrupted without ceremony. Somewhere in those layers there may have been lists of fields, observations of stars, legal agreements, ritual formulas, maps of obligation, names that no one ever spoke again, instructions so mundane no epic poet would have preserved them, and yet so essential that their loss changed what the city could still remember about itself. History frustratingly often preserves the king's boast and loses the canal maintenance schedule, when the canal maintenance schedule may have mattered more the following spring. We have examples, of course, from later Bronze Age collapses and destructions, where archives disappeared or survived only by accident because clay tablets were baked in the very fires that destroyed the buildings storing them. That is one of history's grimmer jokes. Administrative records survive because catastrophe unintentionally fired them into durability. But plenty more vanished. Wooden tablets, textiles, wax records, oral expertise stored in people who fled or died, embodied craft knowledge maintained in workshops that were broken apart, all of that is harder to recover. Every destroyed city is therefore two ruins at once. The physical one we can excavate, and the invisible one made of practices, relationships, and remembered procedures that do not fossilize neatly. And then there is the slow-burning form of destruction that involves no flames at all. Political fragmentation, trade disruption, repeated warfare, drought, crop failure, salinization, disease, decline in labour coordination. These do not look as dramatic in a single image, but they may be even more destructive to memory because they fray the social fabric that keeps memory active. A city does not need to be spectacularly destroyed to begin forgetting itself. It only needs enough strain that maintenance fails repeatedly. Drains clog, canals silt, ritual calendars drift. Specialist knowledge narrows to a few overburdened individuals. Standard measures become less standard. Repair becomes patchwork. Public confidence in official continuity weakens. The city continues, perhaps for generations, but in a thinner form. It still performs order, though with increasing effort, like someone smiling at dinner while the kitchen is visibly on fire. This sort of slow forgetting may be one reason ancient collapses are so difficult to date cleanly. Civilizations often do not end on a Tuesday. They contract, fragment, mutate, relocate, and continue in altered forms. One district is abandoned while another persists. One script disappears while another survives. The ceremonial centre loses authority, but village practices continue. The official memory fails before the local memory does, or the reverse. We prefer tidy endings because they are easier to teach, but the ancient world was under no obligation to make narrative convenient. The great forgetting was often uneven. The Indus Valley civilization is a good example of how unnerving this unevenness can be. It did not simply vanish in a single apocalyptic stroke. Rather, urban centres appear to have declined over time amid changing river systems, shifts in settlement patterns, possible climatic stress, and transformations in social organisation. For us, that can feel unsatisfying because we want a dramatic final scene. For the people living through it, it was probably worse than drama. Drama ends, prolonged uncertainty does not. If rivers shifted, if urban systems became harder to sustain, if centralised practices weakened, then memory itself would have begun to redistribute. Knowledge once concentrated in city institutions may have broken apart into smaller regional traditions, some surviving, some mutating, some disappearing entirely. The writing system, still undeciphered to us, falls silent. Standardised urban planning loses its previous intensity. The city remembers less, and the landscape remembers differently. That pattern matters because it suggests that collapse is not only a fall from complexity, it is also a resorting of memory, what survives. Usually not everything official. Sometimes local agricultural knowledge outlasts bureaucratic record. Sometimes myths survive where measurements do not. Sometimes a sacred site remains important long after the political order that formalized it has gone. Sometimes architectural techniques persist in altered forms. Sometimes nothing remains but a story that later peoples inherit without knowing what event first shaped it. This is one reason flood myths, fire myths, and narratives of ruined great cities appear so often across cultures. They may be carrying not a single historical episode each, but a repeated human experience, the sense that order can fail fast, and that once it does, people scramble to preserve meaning with whatever forms remain. Mesopotamia, again, offers many such lessons. Its cities rose, expanded, were conquered, rebuilt, recentered, and revised across millennia. Environmental stress, salinization, warfare, dynastic turnover, and shifting river systems all affected urban sustainability in different times and places. Yet Mesopotamian culture also displayed astonishing resilience. This is worth remembering because collapse did not always mean total disappearance. Sometimes it meant one city forgetting while another inherited. Ur wanes, Babylon rises, Assyria expands, local traditions persist beneath imperial forms. Writing continues, but what is remembered and by whom changes. That is another kind of forgetting, less dramatic but just as profound. The chain remains unbroken, yet its contents subtly shift. Egypt is often treated as the great exception because of its visual continuity and long-state tradition, but even there memory had to survive repeated shocks. Intermediate periods, local fragmentation, invasions, dynastic changes, religious revisions, environmental pressures, all strained the machinery of continuity. The fact that Egypt remained so committed to restoration tells us how central forgetting was to the ancient imagination. So much Egyptian political language is about re-establishing order, renewing Ma'at, restoring what should be. That only makes sense in a world deeply aware that order can fray. The polished calm of Egyptian monuments is not innocence. It is the product of a civilization haunted by disorder, enough to ritualize continuity with extraordinary force. The Bronze Age collapse across parts of the Eastern Mediterranean later on makes this even clearer. Palace economies failed, trade routes broke, writing systems narrowed or vanished in some regions, cities burned, literacy dropped sharply in places, population patterns shifted. What is striking is not only how much was lost, but how unevenly and selectively memory survived. Some stories likely persisted in oral tradition long after bureaucratic systems fell. Some technologies disappeared and had to be relearned or replaced. Some forms of political organization became impossible for a time. The archaeological record becomes patchier because the institutions that once remembered on purpose had been damaged or removed. You can feel the silence widen. Silence is perhaps the right word here, though not because the people themselves became silent. They still spoke, sang, argued, prayed, traded, mourned, and probably complained with familiar human enthusiasm. The silence belongs more to us. It is the silence created when the systems that would have explained themselves to posterity are gone. We can recover pottery styles, burn destruction layers, settlement contraction, botanical remains, and traces of diet. We can infer stress, adaptation, and movement. But the internal commentary often vanishes. The great forgetting is not only what ancient people lost, it is what later ages can no longer hear clearly. And that returns us to the original question in a sharper form. What if the first civilization knew something we do not? One answer may be that they knew how thin the barrier was between order and forgetting. That sounds bleak, but perhaps it is only honest. We tend to treat civilization as a cumulative staircase. The ancients, living closer to recurrent environmental stress and institutional fragility, may have understood civilization more like a balancing act. Fields must be maintained, water must be read, records must be preserved, rituals must be renewed, skilled labour must be transmitted, authority must remain credible, people must keep cooperating at scale. If enough of those threads fail at once, memory frays faster than monuments suggest. There is also an emotional reality to this that historical summaries often miss. Imagine living in a city whose rituals still proclaim order, while you can plainly see signs of strain. The canal needs repair again, the flood was poor, the granaries feel light, a district has been abandoned. The old names are still spoken, but fewer people seem sure what they mean. The temple still marks the proper day, but what if the day no longer corresponds to the world outside its walls? Ancient people must have felt these dissonances keenly. We know from texts in later societies that anxiety about omens, cosmic disorder, failed harvests and divine displeasure could become intense. This was not irrational panic. It was a culturally structured response to a very real possibility that the systems binding sky, land, city, and memory together were under strain. And strain alters transmission. A craft passed from master to apprentice weakens if workshops are disrupted. A calendar maintained by specialists drifts if specialists are dispersed or institutions impoverished. Oral traditions compress under pressure, retaining dramatic core and losing technical detail. Farmers adapt locally, but their solutions may no longer support centralized urban order. Elites cling to symbolic continuity, even as practical continuity erodes beneath them. This is how a civilization can look familiar, and yet already be forgetting the knowledge that once made that familiarity work. There are other stranger forms of forgetting too. Sometimes later, peoples inherit ruins without inheriting explanations. A mound remains. Giant stones remain. A canal line faintly scars the earth. A broken city wall sits beneath newer settlement. The descendants, whether biological, cultural, or simply local, tell stories. Perhaps giants built it. Perhaps gods cursed it. Perhaps it belonged to ancestors more powerful or more sinful than anyone now living. These stories are not worthless because they are not literal. They often preserve the social fact of rupture. Something significant stood here. Something was lost. Something happened that exceeded ordinary memory. Myth enters where explanation thins. This may be why ancient flood stories are so persistent across regions. Not because every flood myth refers to the same single event, though some may echo real major inundations or post-glacial memories in very distant ways, but because flood is one of the clearest ways civilizations experience both dependence and vulnerability at once. The thing that sustains can also erase. The same river that feeds can destroy the markers by which its feeding was understood. Water takes grain, walls, roads, bodies, archives, and confidence with a kind of impartial efficiency. When it's over, survivors must decide what to preserve. Usually they preserve what can still be carried. Names, warnings, sacred interpretations, practical improvisations, and the memory that they once lived closer to an order now partly gone. Fire, by contrast, often produces a sharper moral imagination. Flood may be divine, cyclical, environmental. Fire in cities can feel like violence, accident, punishment, or the visible moment of political failure. A burned palace says not just that danger exists, but that concentration is risky. A central archive can make memory powerful and fragile at once. A city built magnificently of perishable material is also a city one disaster away from erasing its own instructions. There is almost a lesson hidden there about complexity itself. The more you centralize knowledge, the more efficient it becomes, and the more devastating it is when the center fails. And perhaps that is the deepest layer of the great forgetting. Early civilizations learned to store memory outside the body and beyond the household. That was revolutionary. It allowed cities, law, administration, monumental religion, long-distance coordination, and the preservation of observations across generations. But it also created new vulnerabilities. A flood that once threatened fields now threatened archives. A fire that once destroyed houses now destroyed systems. A war that once scattered communities could now break calendars, measures, institutions, and supply chains. Civilization multiplied memory, then multiplied the possible points of its loss. There is no need to make this melodramatic. Human beings are also very good at rebuilding, patching, scavenging, renaming, and carrying fragments forward. The story is not one long decline into ignorance. It is more erratic than that. Knowledge survives in shards. A ruined canal suggests prior mastery. A ritual continues after its original ecological context changes. A later empire borrows administrative forms from a predecessor. A local farming practice preserves ancient environmental wisdom more faithfully than the court scholars do. Forgetting is real, but so is stubborn continuity. That is why archaeology and ancient history can recover as much as they do. The world is generous with traces if you're willing to work very hard and admit when you still do not understand half of them. Still, some things plainly were lost. Scripts became unreadable. Urban logics vanished. Old hydrological relationships shifted beyond recognition. Sacred geographies were overbuilt, abandoned, or reinterpreted. Technical habits disappeared because the worlds that sustained them disappeared too. The first civilizations may indeed have known things later. Societies no longer knew, not because the ancients were magical, but because they had been forced into an intimacy with recurring natural and social constraints that later worlds partly escaped and then partly forgot how to read. When those first systems failed, some of that intimacy vanished with them, which leaves us in a slightly uncomfortable position. We tend to admire ancient ruins as achievements, and they are. But perhaps we should also view them as warning labels, not simply that civilizations can fall, which is the sort of thing everyone nods at and then assumes applies mainly to other people, but that memory itself has conditions. It must be renewed, distributed wisely, tested against reality, and kept connected to the world it claims to describe. Otherwise, a culture can continue speaking in the language of order, while its practical understanding thins beneath the words. The ancients may have known this in their bones because they watched floods blur field lines, fires swallow records, dynasties fail, and old centres become mounds under open sky. They learned that knowledge is not only discovered, it must be carried through instability, and once enough is lost, those who come later are left looking at remnants, trying to infer how their predecessors managed so much with so little machinery. Which is perhaps the next question waiting in the dark. If the first civilizations built all this before engines, satellites, electrical grids, and modern instruments, then what exactly did they have instead? Not magic, not miracles, and not secret machines buried politely under desert sand, but something more interesting than that. They had systems of observation, memory, labour, and pattern, strong enough to do astonishing things with almost nothing except bodies, tools, and time. They had systems of observation, memory, labour, and pattern strong enough to do astonishing things with almost nothing except bodies, tools, and time. And perhaps that is the point at which the modern imagination becomes a little unreliable, because we are very good at admiring ancient achievements from a distance, while quietly assuming that anything truly difficult must have required either machinery like ours, or secrets dramatic enough to keep a television franchise alive for 20 years. Faced with pyramids, canal networks, planned cities, megalithic structures, mathematically informed architecture, long-distance trade, celestial alignment, and administrative complexity, many people begin to feel a kind of nervous disbelief. Surely there had to be some hidden device, some vanished engine, some forbidden handbook, some miraculous instrument that somehow slipped through the historical record with extraordinary discretion. But the more interesting answer is usually simpler and also much harder for modern people to feel in their bones. Ancient civilizations often did not lack intelligence, method, or technical capacity. What they lacked was our machinery. And because we are so used to solving problems by extending ourselves through machines, we sometimes underestimate what becomes possible when a society extends itself instead through highly trained human systems. Knowledge without machines is not knowledge without structure. In many cases, it is knowledge organized so thoroughly into bodies, routines, materials, and institutions that a machine becomes unnecessary, or at least not yet required. That distinction matters. A machine is not magic. It is stored method embodied in material form. A water clock stores a certain understanding of flow and measurement. A loom stores a certain understanding of tension and pattern. A modern computer stores extraordinary layers of logic and procedure, but it is still, in a broad sense, organized method externalized. Ancient societies externalized knowledge too. They simply did so in different places. In architecture, in apprenticeship, in ritual repetition, in collective labor, in mnemonic language, in standardized units, in root systems, in observations shared across generations, in the physical arrangement of cities, and in the disciplined use of simple tools whose power came not from complexity of mechanism, but from complexity of practice. This can be difficult for us to appreciate because modern life trains us to look for capability in devices rather than in systems of people. If something can be done quickly by a machine now, we assume it must once have been impossible or primitive without one. Yet a remarkable amount of human accomplishment does not actually depend first on advanced machinery. It depends on geometry, planning, measurement, labour coordination, environmental familiarity, abundant repetition, and the willingness to spend time at scales. Most modern institutions would consider slightly offensive. Ancient people often had those things in abundance. What they did not have was the modern expectation that efficiency should always look mechanical. Take construction. Whenever people stand before an ancient monument and ask, almost in accusation, how could they possibly have built this without modern machines? The answer is usually a combination of patience, leverage, organised labour, skilled planning, and social systems capable of mobilizing people over long periods. That may sound less satisfying than imagining anti-gravity devices discreetly misplaced by history, but it has the advantage of being real. Human beings can move astonishingly large stones or vast quantities of earth if they understand friction, ramps, rollers, counterweights, sledges, wet sand, alignment, and manpower distribution. They can do it even more effectively if they have administrators counting rations, supervisors maintaining rhythm, craft specialists shaping joints, and a culture that treats the work as sacred duty, political obligation, seasonal employment, or all three at once. The machine in this case is the society, not in a dehumanizing sense, though ancient states could certainly be dehumanizing enough on their own, but in the structural sense, labour is organized, knowledge is distributed, materials arrive when needed, measurements are standardized, skilled roles are maintained, mistakes are corrected through practice. The visible monument is only the final expression of an invisible operating system made of people. Modern observers often focus on the stone and miss the coordination beneath it, because our instinct is to look for mechanical force first. Ancient civilizations frequently substituted social force, environmental intelligence, and methodical repetition. The same applies to agriculture. We tend to think of modern farming machinery as the obvious dividing line between abundance and scarcity. But before machines amplified agricultural output, civilizations still managed to feed cities, support specialists, and maintain storage systems through intricate combinations of timing, animal power, hand tools, irrigation, soil knowledge, and labour choreography. This required tremendous intelligence, not in the narrow abstract sense alone, but in the ability to integrate many variables across time. When should land be ploughed? Which fields receive water first? How is silt managed? When are workers mobilised for canal cleaning? Which crop varieties are safest in uncertain conditions? How much grain must be stored against a poor year? How should seed grain be protected? These are engineering and logistics questions, even if no engine is present. That is one of the quiet truths ancient history keeps offering us. A machine can increase power, but it does not create the need for thought. In many cases, it only changes the scale at which errors become possible. Ancient irrigation systems, for instance, were not merely holes dug in optimistic directions. They required careful reading of slope, flow, seepage, sediment, maintenance cycles, and political control. A canal that is not maintained becomes a liability. A field overwatered in the wrong soil conditions becomes a long-term problem. A reservoir not cleaned properly becomes an archive of managerial embarrassment. Knowledge without machines often demands more continuous attention because the system cannot simply be switched on and left to hum along while someone else checks a dashboard. This is especially clear in navigation and astronomy. Ancient people crossed deserts, coastlines, rivers, and seas using stars, landmarks, currents, winds, seasonal patterns, oral instruction, and embodied training. To a modern person accustomed to digital mapping, this can feel almost mystical. In truth, it is the opposite. It is perceptual discipline carried to a very high level. A navigator without instruments must notice things most people now pass through without seeing. The colour of water, the angle of waves, the behaviour of birds, the feel of wind at different times, the rising points of stars, the memory of routes carried in story, chant and correction. None of this requires an engine. It requires the cultivation of human beings as instruments. That phrase may be useful here. Ancient civilizations often trained people themselves into instruments of precision. The surveyor becomes a measuring device through practice. The priest-observer becomes a calendar device through repeated sky-watching. The stone mason becomes an accuracy device through years of learned touch and eye. The scribe becomes an accounting device through disciplined notation and memory. The farmer becomes a moisture sensor, a seasonal register, a risk calculator. The whole society is full of human components performing roles that later ages would partly hand off to specialized mechanisms. This is not inferior. It is different, though it is also more vulnerable to disruption because skill lives in bodies that age, die, move, and sometimes decide they are no longer willing to cooperate with empire. And perhaps that is why apprenticeship mattered so much. In a machine-rich society, knowledge can often be separated from the person more easily. Instructions live in manuals, code, interfaces, or automated procedures. In ancient societies, much knowledge moved through imitation, repetition, correction, and long practice under supervision. A carpenter learns not just what to do, but how wood responds through the hands. A potter learns clay by touch, timing, moisture, and kiln behaviour. A builder learns line and angle through repeated work, not merely through abstract geometry. A canal worker learns the look of water moving badly. A healer learns plants and bodies in relation, with all the danger and uncertainty that implies. These are technical educations, though they may not look technical to people trained to expect classrooms, certifications, and branded equipment. There is also a social humility built into this kind of knowledge, because it tends to remain close to materials. Stone has grain and weakness. Mud brick behaves differently in different weather. Wood swells, bronze wears, rope frays, water undermines, clay cracks. Ancient technicians, if we can call them that, lived very near the consequences of material reality. Machines today often buffer us from that intimacy until failure becomes catastrophic. Ancient knowledge, by contrast, was often continuously corrected by friction with the world. A badly cut block does not fit. A poorly aligned drain does not drain. A misjudged canal gradient reveals its opinion immediately and at length. One could argue that this produced a style of intelligence less abstract in some areas and more embodied in others. That's not to say ancient mathematics, astronomy and administration lacked abstraction. They certainly developed it. Mesopotamian mathematics, Egyptian geometry, and later astronomical traditions prove that clearly enough. But even high-level abstraction in ancient societies often remained entangled with practical tasks. Measure the field, account for the grain, divide the labour, track the sky, align the building, predict the season, solve the problem because the world will not wait for philosophical elegance. There is something admirably unsentimental about that. This may also be why ancient technical achievements sometimes look deceptively simple in their component parts. A plumb line is simple, a measuring rod is simple, a water level is simple, a marked chord is simple, a sledge is simple, a ramp is simple. None of these impress a modern person the way a robotic excavator or satellite-guided survey system might. But simplicity of tool is not simplicity of system. A plumb line in trained hands can produce remarkable vertical accuracy. A chord stretched by people who understand layout can generate reliable geometry. A water level can reveal equality of height with quiet authority. Ancient societies often use tools that are conceptually basic, but cognitively amplified through disciplined method. This is a useful antidote to the old fantasy that if we do not immediately understand how something was done, the answer must be exotic. More often, the answer is that people were patient, skilled, and accustomed to forms of collective work we do not practice much anymore. They accepted long timelines, they tolerated repetition, they built traditions of refinement, they corrected errors slowly, they did not need every step to be individually glamorous. Entire cultures can become extremely effective when they stop insisting that every useful process also be quick, novel, and personally fulfilling. Of course, there were limits. Knowledge without machines is often labour-hungry. It consumes bodies, time, and organisational attention. A machine can sometimes replace what once required many people. That is real progress in many contexts, and one should not romanticise the strain ancient labour placed on ordinary lives. Monumental achievements were not produced by floating ideals. They were produced by work, often hard work, sometimes coerced, sometimes seasonal, sometimes communal, sometimes prestigious, sometimes miserable. The absence of machinery does not make a civilization purer. It often makes it more dependent on hierarchy and bodily effort. Still, that does not diminish the intelligence involved. If anything, it sharpens the question of what kind of social knowledge is required to keep large undertakings functioning at all. Writing is another excellent example. We often treat it as a kind of information machine, which in some ways it is. Yet early writing systems did not emerge alongside printing presses, searchable databases, and instant duplication. A written archive in the ancient world was slow, expensive, limited, and powerful precisely because it concentrated labour. Someone had to make the tablet, prepare the surface, know the script, perform the notation, store the record, retrieve it, and teach the next generation to do the same. The archive was not a passive container, it was a maintained organism. That meant literacy, numeracy, and administrative continuity were themselves forms of machineless technical infrastructure. And what a peculiar infrastructure it was. Clay tablets, reed styluses, seals, counting systems, weights, ledgers, inventories, omen series, tax obligations, legal codes, ration records. None of these whirred, none displayed progress bars, yet they allowed cities to function beyond face-to-face familiarity. They extended memory, coordinated action, and stabilized expectation. The fact that so much of this appears dull to modern readers is almost proof of its importance. Civilizations are rarely held together by their most dramatic objects. More often they are held together by an enormous number of repetitive, unglamorous, highly competent acts that nobody writes epic poetry about until they stop working. The same goes for standardized measures. A civilization with agreed units can build, tax, store, and trade more effectively than one relying solely on local intuition. But standards without machines require enforcement through custom, teaching, exemplars, and authority. A weight must be trusted, a length must be reproducible, a capacity must be checked. This too is knowledge without machines, the ability to create consistency through social and material discipline rather than automatic calibration. Once standards drift, whole systems wobble. Ancient societies understood this, even if not every marketplace behaved with saintly precision. There is a broader lesson here about intelligence itself. Modern people often equate intelligence with novelty, speed, abstraction, and invention. Ancient societies certainly valued invention at times, but much of their deepest technical intelligence lay in maintenance, calibration, continuity, and adaptation. Keep the canal working, keep the calendar aligned, keep the stones true, keep the records coherent, keep the grain dry, keep the route known, keep the skill alive in apprentices. This may sound less exciting than revolutionary breakthroughs, yet civilization depends on it far more regularly. In that sense, ancient peoples may have understood something we still struggle to respect, that maintaining a system across generations is often more impressive than creating one quickly. And then there is time. Machines let us compress time. They allow tasks once measured in weeks to be done in hours. This is extraordinarily useful, but it also changes our sense of what counts as possible. Ancient societies could afford projects that took decades or centuries not because their lives were leisurely, which they often were not, but because continuity itself was organized differently. Institutions expected long duration. Dynasties expected succession. Monuments addressed descendants. Agricultural routines returned annually. That meant work could be distributed across time in ways alien to modern commercial urgency. If something required many seasons, that did not necessarily disqualify it. It only required a social structure capable of persisting. This long view helps explain how cities, temples, tombs, irrigation systems and road networks could accumulate without machinery. They were not always conceived under the pressure of immediate completion. They were allowed to ripen through labour, repair, extension, and rebuilding. Again, there is no need to romanticize the cost, but there is reason to admire the confidence such work implies. A society willing to build for centuries possesses a kind of temporal machine of its own, the expectation that future hands will continue the task. There may also have been forms of knowledge we have difficulty noticing precisely because they did not need machines to become visible. Acoustic knowledge in architecture, for instance, the way a chamber carries voice, the way stone cools, the way light enters at different times, the way urban streets channel wind or smell or heat, the placement of courtyards, the shaping of storage spaces, the relation between wall thickness and temperature. Ancient builders did not need thermodynamic equations to know that some forms work better in hot climates than others. They could learn by repeated building, living, and adjustment. Experience becomes design tradition. Tradition becomes expertise. Expertise becomes city form. The more one looks, the less mysterious ancient accomplishment becomes, and the more astonishing it is in a grounded way. Not because there were hidden machines, but because there were so few. Civilizations moved huge loads without engines, measured without lasers, stored information without electronics, coordinated labor without telephones, tracked time without quartz, navigated without satellites, built sanitation without modern pumps, preserved food without refrigeration, and managed long-distance exchange without mechanized transport. That did not make them omnipotent. It made them reliant on skill, redundancy, memory, and social organization to a degree that many machine-rich societies have not had to practice for a very long time. Which raises a slightly uncomfortable thought. Have machines made us more powerful while also narrowing certain kinds of human capability? In many ways, yes. We know more science. We can explain more mechanism. We can build far more complex systems. but we also routinely outsource orientation, memory, estimation, repair, and environmental reading. Lose power, signal, fuel, or digital access, and the fragility of our confidence becomes embarrassingly visible very quickly. Ancient societies were fragile too, though differently. Their knowledge lived in people and institutions. Ours increasingly lives in layers of abstraction and energy-intensive support systems. Both forms can fail. The difference is that ancient people may have been more continuously aware of dependence because they had fewer buffers to hide it. This is where the subject circles back to the first civilization in a more interesting way. Perhaps what they knew was not a lost formula or secret device, but how to organize intelligence without relying on machines to do the noticing for them. How to train observation socially, how to bind memory to place, how to make simple tools powerful through discipline, how to distribute technical skill across a culture, how to build systems robust enough to function through repetition rather than automation. That is not superior in every respect. It can be harsh, laborious, and vulnerable in its own ways, but it is a different human answer to the problem of complexity, and one can feel that difference most sharply in ruins. When we stand before ancient remains, we are often tempted to focus on what is gone: the missing roofs, the missing timber, the missing colour, the lost texts, the vanished workers, the broken machines that were never there. Yet perhaps we should look instead at what those remains still imply: line, measure, coordination, maintenance, memory. The ruin is not only a fragment of stone, it is evidence that whole systems of human capability once operated here with enough steadiness to leave durable form behind. The machines are absent because in many cases the people, routines and institutions were the machines. And once you begin to see that, the ruins become harder to patronize. They stop looking like primitive attempts at civilization and start looking like the exposed bones of alternative competence. Different from ours, certainly. Limited in ways ours is not, but also formidable in ways we no longer instinctively recognize. The question then shifts again. Not how did they do this without machines, but what assumptions make us think real knowledge must always arrive with noise, steel, fuel, and switches. Because beneath our certainty that technology always means more visible mechanism, the ancient world keeps offering the same quiet contradiction. Some of the most consequential knowledge human beings ever developed was built into places, practices, and perceptions so completely that by the time the stones were standing, the people who placed them may hardly have needed to explain themselves at all, at least not until much later, when others arrived among the remains and began mistaking unfamiliar intelligence for impossibility. And once you begin to see that, the ruins become hard to patronize. They stop looking like primitive attempts at civilization and start looking like the exposed bones of alternative competence. Different from ours, certainly. Limited in ways ours is not, but also formidable in ways we no longer instinctively recognize. The question then shifts again. Not how did they do this without machines, but what assumptions make us think real knowledge must always arrive with noise, steel, fuel, and switches. Because beneath our certainty that technology always means more visible mechanism, the ancient world keeps offering the same quiet contradiction. Some of the most consequential knowledge human beings ever developed was built into places, practices, and perceptions so completely that by the time the stones were standing, the people who placed them may hardly have needed to explain themselves at all, at least not until much later, when others arrived among the remains and began mistaking unfamiliar intelligence for impossibility. That is where ruins become dangerous to the modern mind. Not dangerous in any dramatic, curse-filled sense, although ancient architecture has done an admirable job of encouraging that genre for centuries, but dangerous because ruins are very good at undermining confidence. They sit there, worn down, half-buried, broken, stripped of colour, stripped of wood, stripped of roofs, stripped of voices, stripped of the practical clutter that once made them legible to the people who used them every day, and yet they still retain enough force to disturb our tidy assumptions. We prefer history when it behaves like a staircase. Here is the beginning, here is progress, here is improvement, and here, naturally, is us, standing at the top in comfortable shoes. Ruins do not cooperate with that picture. They remind us that complexity existed early, that skill can survive in forms we do not immediately recognize, and that whole systems of knowledge can disappear while their results remain stubbornly visible. This is one of the oddest features of the ancient world. The material achievements are often easier to see than the mental worlds that produced them. We can measure walls, survey foundations, date charcoal, study residues, trace canals, compare brick sizes, calculate alignments, and reconstruct trade networks. But the confidence behind those things, the habits of thought that made them feel reasonable, necessary, or obvious, are much harder to recover. Ruins preserve outcomes better than assumptions. That is why they can seem so baffling. We are looking at the answer without hearing the question that once made it obvious. And because human beings dislike uncertainty, we tend to fill that silence quickly. Sometimes we do it responsibly, with archaeology, careful comparison, environmental data, experimental reconstruction, and modesty about what cannot be known. Sometimes we do it less responsibly, with dramatic declarations, suspiciously certain documentaries, and theories that appear to have been assembled entirely from the ingredients of confidence and caffeine. But even serious scholarship at its best is still dealing with a frustrating limitation. The ruin is never the civilization. It is the remainder after weather, theft, rebuilding, erosion, fire, flood, war, neglect, repurposing, and sheer time have removed most of what once made the place ordinary. Ordinary is an important word here because ruins are very poor at preserving normal life in proportions that feel normal to us. Stone survives, ceramics survive, fired clay survives, earthworks survive in altered form, but cloth, baskets, leather, timber, spoken explanation, gestures, smells, seasonal routines, legal quarrels, the sound of water in channels, the heat of courtyards, the repair habits of workers, and the thousands of repetitive acts that made the city function do not survive nearly as well. As a result, we inherit an ancient world made oddly monumental by preservation. The dramatic parts stay. The background goes missing. It is a little like trying to understand modern society after all that survived were parking structures, drainage pipes, a few concrete stairwells, and some government forms baked accidentally in a warehouse fire. One could infer many things, but one would still be missing the part where anyone explained why the parking structure was always full and everyone was somehow still late. This distortion matters because it shapes how we think about intelligence. Modern people often judge past societies by the visible remains that look closest to what we already respect. Straight lines impress us. Huge stones impress us. Precise alignments impress us. Administrative texts impress us when translated into something that sounds suitably official. But many forms of ancient competence are underrepresented because they did not fossilize in flattering ways. Local ecological knowledge rarely leaves a monument. Social trust leaves even less. Skilled maintenance leaves traces only when it fails. A working canal looks obvious until you ask what it takes to keep one working for generations in silting conditions, under political strain, and then suddenly the obvious thing becomes much less obvious. Ruins therefore create a peculiar bias. They make the past seem at once grander and simpler than it was. Grander because what survives is often large, dense, and durable. Simpler because the subtle systems around it are gone. We see the temple, not the living sequence of timing, storage, movement, teaching, and labour that made the temple one organ in a much larger body. We see the city wall, not the administrative memory of previous attacks, labour obligations, and social fear that justified its upkeep. We see the pyramid, not the surrounding world of surveyors, quarry workers, transport planners, grain provisioners, seasonal labour structures, craft hierarchies, and ideological commitments that made the pyramid thinkable in the first place. The ruin gives us the noun and takes away the verbs, and once the verbs are gone, certainty becomes very easy to fake. One can stand before a ruin and tell almost any story with enough confidence. This structure was purely ceremonial. This building was an observatory. This alignment proves advanced astronomy. This chamber was symbolic. This site was political. This monument encoded mathematical secrets. Sometimes those stories are partly right. Sometimes they are elegant nonsense. The trouble is that ruins are patient enough to survive our projections. They do not interrupt. They let generation after generation arrive with new assumptions and use the old stones as mirrors. This is not only a problem for fringe theories, though fringe theories do enjoy ruins with almost indecent enthusiasm. It is a human problem in general. We interpret the past through the categories available to us. 19th century scholars saw ancient states through imperial habits. 20th century analysts often emphasized economy, administration, and systems in ways shaped by their own age. Today we bring concerns about environment, networks, information, cognition, and collapse. Some of this is progress. Much of it is genuinely illuminating. But it also means that our certainty about ruins is always partly autobiographical. We do not only excavate ancient cities, we excavate them while standing inside our own assumptions about what matters most. That is why the ruins beneath our certainty are not just literal ruins, they are the buried uncertainties under modern progress itself. We often tell ourselves a story in which later means more advanced, more rational, more complete. In some ways that is indisputably true. We understand physics better than Sumerian priests. We understand pathogens better than Old Kingdom administrators. We can image the interior of pyramids without disassembling them, which is generally better for everyone involved. Yet progress in one register can conceal losses in another. We can become more analytically powerful while less directly observant, more mechanically capable while less environmentally literate, more connected in information while less rooted in place. Ruins force this uncomfortable comparison because they preserve evidence of societies that knew less science than we do, and yet often knew their own ecological, spatial and temporal context with extraordinary intimacy. There is another reason ruins disturb certainty. They prove that permanence is often theatrical. Ancient cities worked very hard to appear stable. Monumental architecture, repeated forms, aligned streets, ceremonial centres, dynastic inscriptions, sacred foundations. All of these say, in one way or another, this order is durable, this arrangement belongs, this world has been made solid. Yet eventually the roof falls in, the plaster flakes off, the sacred axis becomes a tourist map, and the city's great confidence is reduced to weathered outlines and scholarly arguments. The ruin is what happens when permanence loses the institutions that performed it. That should probably make modern people a little less smug. We also build as though our systems are obvious and durable. Future archaeologists, assuming they are in a generous mood, may one day study our infrastructure and conclude that we too had a touching faith in concrete. Ruins also reveal the gap between use and meaning. A building may have served many purposes at once when alive, but in ruin it becomes one thing in our minds, because classification is easier than ambiguity. Temple, palace, granary, tomb, administrative centre. Those words are useful, but they can also flatten ancient reality. A temple might store goods, regulate calendar, stage public authority, and connect sacred narrative to agricultural timing. A palace might be economic hub, ceremonial theatre, archive and political machine all together. A street might guide drainage, trade, processions and social hierarchy. Once ruined, the surviving footprint cannot by itself tell us how heavily each function weighed in lived experience. We recover fragments and then, with great hope, compose categories. Sometimes the categories help. Sometimes they merely tidy what was never tidy. That is one reason archaeology is at its best when it remains slightly irritated with certainty. Good archaeologists spend a great deal of time saying versions of "this may indicate," "the evidence suggests," one possible interpretation, and, unfortunately, we cannot conclude. This can be disappointing for anyone hoping history will behave like a solved puzzle, yet that hesitation is not weakness, it is respect for the actual condition of the evidence. Ruins deserve that respect because they are partial survivors, not complete testimonies. They show enough to challenge us, but rarely enough to let us relax. There is also the matter of survivorship bias in a more literal sense. We are often most impressed by the ancient things that lasted, and things often last because they were already exceptional in material or social investment. Monumental stone survives better than vernacular architecture. Elite inscriptions survive more readily than ordinary instruction. Tombs are often preserved because they were sealed, buried, or revered. Official memory survives differently from common practice. This means our image of the past is skewed toward what powerful people built, what durable materials allowed, and what accidents of preservation favoured. The result is a past that can seem more centralised, more monumental, and sometimes more coherent than it really was. Yet even with all these distortions, ruins still communicate something undeniable. They communicate competence. Not magical competence, not always benevolent competence, but the ability of human groups to coordinate skill, belief, labour and environmental knowledge into lasting form. That is not a small thing. To lay out a city, maintain drainage, align a sacred complex, sustain record keeping, manage agriculture, and reproduce these systems across generations is an immense collective achievement. When we fail to grasp it, the problem is often not that the evidence is too weak, but that our own assumptions about what counts as real intelligence are too narrow. Modern certainty, for example, tends to privilege explicit explanation. If there is no written manual, no blueprint, no formula in familiar notation, we become uneasy. How did they know this? How did they do that? Where are the instructions? But humans often know how to do difficult things without preserving those things in forms that later observers would recognize instantly. Tradition can hold procedure. Apprenticeship can hold calibration. Ritual can hold timing. Place can hold orientation. Repetition can hold design logic. None of these are mystical. They are simply different storage systems. Ruins remind us of that because they are what remain after the storage systems around them have decayed unevenly, and there is a further twist. Sometimes ruins are impressive not only because they show what ancient people knew, but because they show what they no longer needed to explain to one another. A carefully oriented structure may have been entirely legible to its users without commentary, because the relevant sky event, seasonal significance, ritual expectation, and architectural tradition were all common knowledge within the culture. We, arriving much later, stare at the same structure and demand a label. What is this for? Why is it angled this way? Why here? The urge is understandable, but it can also be revealing. Perhaps part of the reason the ruin feels mysterious is that it was once embedded in a world so thick with shared knowledge that much of its meaning went unstated. This should sound familiar, because the same is true of our own lives. Imagine a future archaeologist uncovering a modern suburban roundabout, a data centre, a sports stadium, and a supermarket loading dock, all without language, power, or cultural continuity. They could measure, compare, and hypothesize. They might identify traffic systems, storage, crowd movement, perhaps refrigeration if lucky, maybe ritual spectacle if they were feeling dramatic about sports. But whole layers of lived assumption would be missing. Why this location made economic sense, how fuel shaped distance, how schedules governed shopping, why certain logos mattered, how digital systems coordinated inventory beyond visible space. The ruins of our certainty would also be baffling in selective ways. That comparison is useful because it softens the old temptation to treat ancient ambiguity as proof of ancient mystery in the supernatural sense. Most of the time it is simply proof of historical distance. We are seeing remains without continuity. The difficulty is not that the ancients were incomprehensible beings, It is that we no longer share the worlds that made their choices ordinary. Still, acknowledging that should not make us too comfortable. Historical distance is not a harmless inconvenience. It can conceal losses we do not know how to measure. Whole styles of attention may vanish without leaving direct names behind. Whole relationships to place, material and recurrence may disappear while their products remain visible enough to provoke admiration, but not enough to teach imitation. This is perhaps where the ruin becomes philosophical, though in the most grounded way possible. It asks whether knowledge is only what can be written down, formalized and generalized, or whether knowledge also includes tacit competence so deeply woven into life that it becomes invisible until broken. Ancient ruins are full of the second kind. We can see that something worked. We can sometimes reconstruct how, but the lived certainty of the people who did it, the taken for granted sense of right proportion, right timing, right orientation, right material response is often gone. We are left with evidence and absence in roughly equal measure. No wonder ruins attract myth. Myth is what people make when evidence still carries emotional force but explanatory continuity has thinned. A giant wall must have been built by giants. A buried city must have offended gods. A precise alignment must conceal sacred mathematics. Sometimes these stories are wrong in detail but right in instinct. They recognize that something significant happened here, something beyond the casual abilities of the present community to explain directly. That recognition can be sincere even when the explanation is imaginative. In a sense, myth is one of the ways societies admit the presence of lost competence. The scientific study of ruins is more disciplined, of course, but it too is animated by that admission. Archaeology exists because human beings keep finding durable traces of vanished order and feeling compelled to ask what sort of minds, institutions, ecologies, and routines stood behind them. Every trench, every shard, every post hole, every pollen sample, every wear pattern on stone steps is part of that effort to push back against the silence. Sometimes the answers are wonderfully specific, sometimes they remain stubbornly broad. But even broad answers matter. They tell us that the past was populated not by crude ancestors waiting to become us, but by people fully capable of building worlds whose internal logic we still struggle to grasp completely. And this is where the ruins beneath our certainty become especially uncomfortable. Because the more honestly we look at ancient remains, the harder it is to maintain the cheerful modern belief that improvement is always simple accumulation. Human societies do not only gain, they also trade, neglect, centralize, outsource, standardize, and forget. They become stronger in one register and weaker in another. Ancient people lacked our machines, yet often retained broader embodied contact with the practical conditions of their existence. We possess enormous explanatory power, yet frequently live at several removes from the water, soil, seasons and local materials that still determine more than we like to admit. The ruin, in that sense, is not only the remains of their world, it is also a mirror held up to ours. Standing among ruins, one begins to sense that certainty itself is a historical luxury. The first cities could not afford too much of it. They lived close to flood, drought, political turnover, fire, salinity, labour strain, and the constant work of keeping order believable. They probably knew that systems fail, and that memory must be maintained actively or it thins. Modern societies often behave as though their systems are neutral background conditions. Water arrives, food arrives, light arrives, data arrives, time arrives in clean segments on illuminated screens. The machinery works until it does not. When it falters, we are often startled in ways ancient peoples might have found unpersuasive. They knew dependence more intimately. That may be the sharpest lesson ruins offer. Not that the ancients had all the answers, but that they lived with fewer illusions about independence from process. Their cities rose out of soil, water, labour, season, hierarchy, and repeated acts of maintenance. Ours do too, of course, but the layers are more hidden. Ruins strip away the cover. They show the dependency after the story of permanence has failed. They show what was holding the system together, or at least where the holding once happened. And once you allow ruins to do that work on your mind, the question at the centre of all this becomes harder to dismiss with a smile. What if the first civilization knew something we don't? Not in the cheap sense of secret weapons or impossible energy sources or mystical frequencies that sound suspiciously like a late-night sales pitch. Something more ordinary and more unsettling than that. What if they knew how much of civilization depends on forms of attention that are easy to lose once systems grow large enough to hide their own foundations? What if they knew that memory is not secure just because institutions exist? What if they knew that certainty itself can become a kind of blindness? Because the ruin does not only tell us what they built, it tells us what survived their forgetting and what may yet survive ours. And if that is true, then the last question is no longer really about them alone. It is about us. If those first cities inherited ways of reading sky, land, water and time that later worlds only partly preserved, and if the ruins still point toward capacities we have underestimated for centuries, then the most important question may not be what they once knew. It may be what, in becoming so sure of our own progress, we have allowed ourselves to stop noticing. So if they knew something, what have we lost? By this point, the most honest answer is probably not a machine, not a formula, not a missing metal, not a map to buried engines under the sand, and not a single glowing secret that would make the modern world slap its forehead and say, of course, that was it. It is something more difficult to package than that, and for that reason it is also easier to ignore. What may have been lost is a way of paying attention, a way of noticing pattern before crisis, of reading place before control, of remembering limits before exceeding them, and of treating time not as a row of numbered boxes but as a set of relationships that had to be maintained. That sounds almost disappointingly modest at first. People often hope the ancient world will offer a more dramatic prize. We like our lost knowledge with a bit of theatre. We want hidden chambers, vanished sciences, celestial codes, perhaps a priest pointing at the stars and revealing something modern physicists somehow overlooked while surrounded by computers and grant paperwork. But history is rarely so cooperative. The things human beings lose most often are not dazzling objects. They are habits, skills, baselines, ways of seeing so ordinary in their own time that nobody thought to preserve them with warning labels for the future. And habits can be very important indeed. Think about how much of modern life is built on not noticing. We do not need to know where our water comes from in any intimate sense, only that it appears when the tap is turned. We do not need to know the sky to travel. We do not need to know the soil to eat. We do not need to know the horizon to orient ourselves. We do not need to know local seasons in much detail because lighting, shipping, storage, transport and digital scheduling soften the edges of place. This is a tremendous achievement in many ways. It is also a strange condition for a species that spent most of its existence learning by direct dependence. The first civilizations did not have the luxury of that distance. They lived near the source of consequence. The river rose or did not. The soil gave or failed. The flood arrived on time or did not. The star said one thing and the fields answered another, and if the answer was bad, nobody could smooth it over with overnight delivery and a weather app. This meant that knowledge had to remain close to reality. It had to be checked continuously against land, water, season, labour and survival. There was no room for too much beautiful theory that did not work when the canal silted up. Perhaps that is the first thing they knew, and that we lose repeatedly whenever systems become successful enough to hide their foundations. They knew that civilization rests on recurring material conditions that do not care about prestige. Water still has to move, food still has to grow, soil still has to recover, waste still has to go somewhere. Time still has to be kept in relation to things beyond human preference. You can build splendid institutions above these truths, and ancient people certainly did, but the truths remain stubbornly underneath. Modern societies know this too, technically. We have fields of study for all of it, entire ministries, departments, sensors and simulation models. Yet there is a difference between knowing something as information and living as though it is your daily reference point. The early world may also have held a stronger sense of limit. Not limit in the moralizing sense, as though ancient people were all wise minimalists living in tasteful ecological balance and never making terrible decisions, because that would be nonsense. Ancient societies overreached too. They strained landscapes, fought wars, exploited labour, salinized fields, and committed all the usual human errors with admirable determination. Still, many of them lived closer to feedback. The land answered more quickly and more obviously. If irrigation was poorly managed, yields changed. If canals were neglected, water told you. If flood levels failed, the problem arrived in your granary, not in an academic report 6 years later. This kind of immediate correction teaches a society to think in terms of thresholds. Thresholds are something modern life is very good at hiding until they are crossed. Groundwater declines for years before panic. Climate patterns shift gradually until storms begin landing in impossible places. Topsoil thins quietly. Biodiversity falls politely in the background. Rivers are straightened, wetlands drained, coastlines built over, and then everyone acts deeply surprised when the water remembers its old route. Ancient people would not have solved all of this neatly, but they may have recognized the structure of the problem faster. They were used to living where thresholds mattered. The river before flood and after flood are not the same world. A field before salinity and after salinity is not the same field. A city before canal maintenance fails and after it fails is not the same city. Their categories were probably less buffered, less insulated, and therefore sometimes more honest. Another thing that may have been lost is distributed knowledge. In many machine-rich societies, knowledge becomes concentrated in specialists, institutions, systems, and infrastructure that most people use without understanding deeply. Again, this is not entirely bad. It is sensible that not everyone manufactures antibiotics or understands semiconductor physics. I would rather not return to a world in which the average person must perform their own dental surgery under moonlight. But there is a cost to increasing complexity through specialization. The ordinary person can become powerful in use and helpless in interruption. Ancient societies had specialists too, of course. Priests, scribes, surveyors, builders, healers, administrators. Yet much essential environmental and practical knowledge remained widely distributed because daily life required it. You did not need to be an astronomer to notice the moon. You did not need to be a hydrologist to know the river was behaving badly. You did not need a professional orientation consultant to know where sunrise lay in relation to your settlement. That broad distribution of practical competence creates a different sort of society. It is not necessarily kinder or freer, but it can be more resilient in certain ways. When many people know how things work at the local level, a disruption does not instantly become incomprehensible. When almost no one knows how anything functions beneath the interface, trouble spreads with a peculiar psychological force. A modern power outage is inconvenient partly because systems stop, but also because it reveals how much confidence depended on invisible continuity. Ancient people faced interruptions too, often far worse ones, but they may have inhabited those interruptions with less illusion about what continuity really required. There is also the question of time. This may be the hardest part to recover in imagination because our sense of time is so thoroughly managed by clocks, calendars, platforms, deadlines, fiscal years, and notifications. We talk about saving time as though it were a misplaced object that has slipped behind the sofa. We divide life into units, optimize them, sell them, complain about them, and then wonder why everything feels simultaneously rushed and curiously detached. Ancient civilizations had schedules, obligations, and highly organized systems of timing too, but their time was still more visibly tied to recurrence. Sun, moon, flood, season, harvest, stars. The units of time were not fully abstracted from physical cycles. That probably changed thought in subtle ways. A society living by recurring environmental signals is constantly reminded that life is patterned, but not fully under command. You can count, but you cannot force spring. You can predict flood, but you cannot legislate rain. You can align ritual to solstice, but you cannot negotiate with the horizon. There is a kind of realism built into this, perhaps even a sort of intellectual posture. Time is not just what humans arrange. Time is what humans enter, respond to, and briefly coordinate themselves within. We may still know that in theory, but in practice, modern people often experience time as something manufactured socially and delivered electronically. Ancient people may have had a stronger felt sense that time preceded them, exceeded them, and had to be read well rather than merely allocated. And then there is memory, which may be the largest loss of all. The first civilizations built memory into place, into processions, field systems, canals, ritual calendars, urban layouts, standard measures, temple routines, and stories attached to particular landscapes. Memory was not only text, it was embodied, spatial, seasonal, and social. Modern societies preserve incredible amounts of information, obviously, far more than any ancient city ever could. Yet preservation is not the same thing as memory in the older sense. We store more and remember less in the body. We archive more and rehearse less collectively. We can retrieve information instantly while becoming oddly detached from the conditions that once made remembering itself a civic act. This creates a paradox. We are surrounded by records and still vulnerable to forgetting what matters most at the level of lived relation. A city may have exhaustive digital records and still not know its own watershed well enough. A nation may produce climate reports and still build in floodplains as though maps were decorative. A person may know more facts about astronomy than an ancient farmer, and yet be unable to read season, direction, weather, or moonlight with any confidence. None of this means the ancient farmer was in some total sense wiser. It means wisdom is not one thing. Knowledge expands in some dimensions and contracts in others. What if that is the real answer? Not that the first civilization knew everything, but that they possessed a broader integration of kinds of knowing that we have since split apart. The sky was not separate from agriculture. Agriculture was not separate from ritual. Ritual was not separate from political order. Political order was not separate from water management. Water management was not separate from social memory. Everything touched everything else, because reality left them very little choice. Modern systems, by contrast, are extraordinarily good at division. Expert fields, agencies, departments, models, supply chains, disciplines, dashboards. This allows enormous precision, but it can also produce blindness at the joints. Ancient people may not have had better explanations, but they often lived in a less compartmentalized world. That matters because many of our worst modern mistakes happen precisely at the joints. Water policy that ignores ecology, agriculture that ignores soil time, urban planning that ignores drainage memory, economic systems that ignore seasonal reality, technology that ignores maintenance, governance that ignores the difference between an abstract map and a lived landscape. Ancient civilizations did some of this too, certainly, and paid for it. But they may have held, at least for periods of time, a stronger institutional memory that these things were linked. Their temples, calendars, canals, and administrative systems were not always separate domains. They were overlapping responses to the same basic truth. Human order depends on forces larger than human preference. There is another possibility, quieter, but perhaps even more important. What we have lost may be not only knowledge, but calibration. Ancient people may have had a more stable sense of what normal looked like in a given landscape, because they were forced to observe it directly across seasons and generations. They knew the usual flood line, the usual soil behaviour, the expected star rise, the ordinary depth of a channel, the usual timing of birds or fish or wind. That kind of baseline is invaluable. Without it, anomaly becomes harder to detect. We moderns often rely on instruments and datasets to create baselines, which is often excellent and far more precise. But culturally, at the everyday level, many people now live with almost no intimate baseline for place at all. We move often, we live indoors. We use systems that abstract environment into utilities. It is entirely possible to inhabit a region for years and know almost nothing about how its water, seasons, soils and skies actually behave. That is a peculiar form of poverty hidden inside technological wealth. Now, none of this means we should try to become ancient again. History is not a lifestyle brand, and the Bronze Age is not a practical housing policy. We're not going to return to temple calendars and ox-drawn surveying out of pure respect for tradition, nor should we. There is no virtue in pretending we can simply reverse complexity. The point is not to romanticize loss, it is to identify it honestly. If something valuable has gone missing, the task is not to worship the past, but to notice what the past was doing that we no longer do well. So what might be recoverable? Perhaps first, the idea that knowledge should remain in contact with consequence. That sounds simple, but it is not. It means designing systems so the people making decisions remain close enough to the physical world that correction arrives before catastrophe. It means not allowing abstraction to become a hiding place. It means asking, very practically, who still knows this river, this soil, this coast, this seasonal pattern, this drainage path, this local climate in lived rather than purely modelled terms. It means recognising that data is powerful, but data detached from patient familiarity can still miss what the old world noticed with fewer instruments and more proximity. Second, perhaps, the recovery of place-based memory, not nostalgia. Memory. Where does water go here? What used to flood here? What species used to be common? What was this field, this marsh, this channel, this shoreline, this road before it wore its current name? Ancient people built cities by inheriting answers to such questions, even if they later forgot them. We often build as though these questions are optional, and then behave betrayed when the landscape declines to cooperate. Recovering local memory may be one of the most practical forms of intelligence available to us, and it is striking how often modern planning rediscovers this only after failure. Third, a more serious respect for maintenance. This may sound absurdly plain after all our talk of stars, floods, temples and lost knowledge, but plain truths are often the ones civilizations skip when they are feeling grand. Ancient societies knew, because they had to, that order is renewed by upkeep. Canals must be cleared, ritual calendars must be corrected, walls must be repaired, fields must be monitored, measures must be standardized again and again. Modern societies also rely on maintenance, but culturally we are often in love with innovation and strangely embarrassed by upkeep, as though keeping systems alive were less impressive than inventing them. The ruins of the ancient world argue the opposite very strongly. Much of what lasted did so because somebody maintained it for a very long time. There may also be something to recover in the realm of attention itself. Ancient people lived under skies they could read, and in landscapes they could not afford to ignore. Most modern people live among signals designed to seize attention, while teaching very little about the material world sustaining them. That is not a moral failure at the individual level so much as a structural condition. Still, it changes perception. To recover some of what was lost may simply mean retraining notice. What phase is the moon in? Where does the sun set from here in winter? What direction does water move after heavy rain? Which trees flower first? Which wind means temperature will change? How does this place smell before weather shifts? These are tiny questions, almost embarrassingly small beside geopolitics and machine learning and orbital mechanics. Yet they are also the questions from which older civilizations built practical intelligence upward, and perhaps the deepest recovery would be humility. The first civilizations may not have been wiser in every sense, but they may have been less able to pretend that human systems floated free of earth, water, time, and memory. Their entire world punished that illusion. Ours delays the punishment just enough for arrogance to mature nicely before the bill arrives. Humility, in this context, does not mean self-hatred or anti-modern sentiment. It means remembering that all civilization, including ours, is conditional. It runs on material flows, inherited knowledge, social trust, maintenance, environmental stability to some degree, and habits of attention that can weaken long before the buildings fall. That may be why the ancient world still feels so close when you look at it long enough. Not because their answers were ours, but because their problem was ours in an earlier form. How do human beings build order without forgetting the conditions that make order possible? How do we create complexity without becoming blind to dependence? How do we preserve memory without letting it harden into dead ritual? How do we keep knowledge in contact with life? Those questions are not buried in the past. They are still here, sitting quietly underneath modern certainty, much as they sat beneath the first walls of the first cities. So if they knew something, what have we lost? Maybe we have lost the habit of treating the world as legible in ways that matter before disaster. Maybe we have lost some of the ability to carry knowledge in common rather than only in specialized systems. Maybe we have lost a stronger sense of sequence, season, and place. Maybe we have lost the patience to think across generations unless a financial chart happens to reward it. Maybe we have lost the discipline of looking at what sustains us with enough regularity that change becomes visible early when there is still time to answer it well. Or maybe more simply, we have lost the feeling that civilization is something you must keep learning from the ground up. The first cities seem to have known that. Their stones, drains, calendars, alignments, canals and rituals all point in that direction. Whatever else they believed, however mistaken they often were, however harshly they organised life, they acted as though order had to be renewed through attention. They did not assume it would run forever on yesterday's success. They watched the sky. They watched the water. They watched the land. They stored grain. They repaired lines. They repeated calendars. They built memory into place because they knew forgetting had consequences. And perhaps that is the final reason the question stays with us. Not because it flatters the past, but because it unsettles the present. The ruins do not ask us to envy ancient people. They ask whether we still know what our own civilization depends on with anything like the same seriousness. Whether we can still read enough of the world to notice when the pattern is shifting. Whether all our power has made us more secure, or merely more buffered from the early signs of trouble. Whether progress has expanded knowledge while also thinning certain essential forms of attention. Those are not comfortable questions, especially at the end of a long look backward. But perhaps that is exactly why they matter. The first civilization may not have left us a hidden answer. It may have left us a demonstration. Human beings can build immense, complex, ordered worlds without fully escaping dependence on land, water, time, memory, and each other. They can forget this and suffer for it. They can remember it and still suffer, but often with more warning and more dignity. And somewhere between those two possibilities, every civilization, ancient or modern, has to choose how carefully it intends to look. So tonight, if you step outside for a moment or glance through a window, or simply picture the nearest river, the nearest patch of ground, the shape of the moon, the direction the weather usually comes from where you live, you may be doing something very old, something older than cities, older than writing, older than all the systems we have built to keep ourselves from needing to notice. You may be participating, however lightly, in the same act from which so much of civilization began. The decision to pay attention before forgetting does it for you.